Good morning, everybody. Welcome. It's the 7th of September. This is the meeting of the NHS Lancashire South Cumbria Integrated Care Board. We have apologies for absence today from Ibrahim Adia. He's away. He's now left his post as a chair at Lancs Teaching Hospital, so he's now a full member of our board. We also have apologies from Caroline Donovan, partner member in Mental Health Services, who's away, and John Redman. Now, John is new to join us as the participant member, Director of Adult and Social Care, currently at Cumbria County Council and Children's Services. And John will be with us in future meetings. I also welcome a new participant member, Abdul Razak, Director of Public Health at Blackburn with Darwin Authority. We're expecting Abdul. I think he's just been a bit delayed on his journey here. I'll welcome him when he arrives. Also welcome to a first meeting Maggie Oldham, who's joining the team as the Chief of Planning, Performance and Strategy. Formally starts on Monday, but delighted that you could make it to today's meeting, Maggie, and please just join in the meeting the same way everybody else does today. Also today, Deborah, who keeps me properly in order, is unable to attend the meeting today, but will be critically watching on the live stream to make sure that I get everything right. I've not been notified of any new declarations of interest. We meet today. It's a challenging time, of course, for the health service across Lancashire and South Cumbria, and indeed across the country, and will, in our agenda, reflect on a number of the challenges that we face and how we're addressing them. We have a new Secretary of State, Dr. Teresa Coffey, starting in post. It's made introductory statements, really, in her approach to the job, which I think is very, very clear. No doubt we'll get to learn more over the coming days and weeks about the Secretary of State's approach and requirements as she settles into the role. We welcome her very much into the job and look forward to working with her and ministerial colleagues as we go forward. It is a tough time, not just in the health service, but be very familiar with a number of the cost of living challenges, the energy prices. We await what the new Prime Minister may say about all of that, but the context in which we discuss our business today is a very challenging one for the country, and we must be mindful of the impact that some of the current pressures have on the communities and the society that we serve. And I know that we'll be mindful of all of that as we go through our business this morning. With the minutes of our last meeting, which was on the 27th of July, one of the things that I've asked Deborah to do is where people have joined our meeting to make a contribution, not as members of the board, but have come to join in discussion about particular items, that we're very specific in the note about who they are, where they're from, and the contribution that they're making in those items. So we'll make a little bit of amendment to fill in some of that detail. Are there any other issues people want to raise from the minutes of the last meeting? Kevin.
Thanks, David. Under 1822, bottom of page 4, where we talk about the resolves and the issues around the hyperacute, the second bullet point there noted it says negligible impact on hyperacute services. I think the point I raised was that small numbers could have actually a significant impact. So I think we should take out that whole point about it being negligible and just say we'll monitor the impact on the services at Lancashire Teaching.
Thanks, Kevin, I agree. We shall make that change. Anything else from the minutes for anybody? Okay, subject to those changes, can I adopt the minutes?
Great.
Thank you. Kevin, Chief Executive's report.
Good morning, everyone. Put together a report just to give you an overview on what happened since the last board meeting, what the current areas of focus are, what's emerging on the horizon. So this is the first of its kind. Would welcome feedback on the format and content, so we get it right as we go forward. Just a few things to highlight. Continuing healthcare, we have continued to make good progress there. Probably the big issue is dealing with the backlog, which I think the numbers on that are rising. We brought in Mersey Internal Audit Service to help to work with us and the CSU on addressing those backlog issues. Obviously, there's some leadership change underway. We can talk more about that later at Lancashire and South Cumbria Trust. Chris Oliver is now the acting Chief Executive there, and the Trust is now undertaking the recruitment for the chair position. And I think there are a number of board positions that come up that end of their term this year, so there will be further recruitment once the chair is imposed. We have appointed and announced the 4 place-based leaders. So Louise Taylor from Lancs County Council is going to be the place-based leader for the Lancashire Partnership. Karen Smith from Blackpool Council will be the place-based leader for Blackpool. We've got Claire Richardson, who will take the Blackburn with Darwin role. She's from the area, has worked in the system before, but joins us from Rochdale. And Jane Scattergood, who is already in our system, will be looking after the Westmoreland and Furness partnership there. We've also got Maggie as my deputy and the chief on performance, strategy and planning, and we've appointed Asim Patel to be our chief digital officer. Asim is from Blackburn originally, currently works with Merseycare in that space. The transition from the 8 CCGs to the new ICB is nearing completion. There are still a few areas that we're working through. In particular, the area structures. We've got interim arrangements in for the old 5 places that need to be transitioned to the 4 new partnerships. So there's a bit of work there. And there are some staff who are on secondment and on short-term contracts that we're working through as well. But it's largely complete. Most staff now have got roles in the new organisation, and I think that has been done at breakneck speed, and congratulations to the team involved in all of that. There's been quite a lot of typical, isn't it? August, civil service gets active and produces quite a lot of guidance in the summer period. There's been a ton of guidance on how the integrated care partnerships will work, what the new integrated care strategy should look like, what the planning, the long-term plan should be like for the ICB, etc. So there's quite a lot of material if you're interested to follow through on. Big issue on the horizon, short term, is winter pressures and planning. We've got monies from the NHS for a couple of things that are relevant to this. We'll have a deeper dive on this at the next board meeting, so we'll have a full report on this, so we'll pull it all together for you. But we've got about £20 million, I think, for a combination of things. One is virtual wards, where we're going to, over a couple of winters, we're going to add up to around 800 beds, I think it is, Kevin, isn't it, around the system, which is a really significant addition to our capacity. So we've got, about 4,000 beds, so that's nearly 20%. It's significant. And the other issue is we got monies for increasing capacity of our system. One of the key items there is a facility in the Preston area, Finney House, where we're looking to develop an intermediate care facility. There'll be more on that in the October board, but again, that's potentially just short of 100 beds over time, and that's a region-wide project of significance, really. That will make a difference. So that's probably the big issue, but there'll be a full report at the next board on the whole issue of winter pressures. And when we get to the performance report later on, this idea of having a general performance report and a deep dive on a topic, we thought it would be appropriate in October to do urgent and emergency care for obvious reasons. And I think that links nicely with the deeper report on winter pressures, and it's exactly the right time to be doing it. Happy to answer any questions, and I would welcome your feedback on whether this sort of format works for you and whether we need to make any changes going forward.
Thanks, Kevin. Before I invite people to comment or ask questions, welcome Abdul. First meeting, participant member, Director of Public Health, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much, and my sincere apologies really due to traffic issues for my lateness.
No problem. Right, Roy first, please.
Thank you, Chairman. First of all, can I say I very much welcome this report from the Chief Executive. I think it's really a very strong message in there that we get as a board about the impact, I think, of some of the issues that we're having to deal with, but also I think some of the positivity that's within this particular report we should all recognise. I'd just like to pick up on a couple of issues that are in there. One is with regard to the place-based partnerships and reference in there to Jeff Jolliffe chairing a reconstituted place development steering group, which again is extremely welcomed, I think. Really important that we try and get those place-based partnerships up and running and making some decisions on behalf of the localities fairly quickly, I think. And I know Jess was working extremely hard before we actually established the ICB board to get those place-based partnerships in a position to be able to move to that very quickly. So I very much welcome that. We talk about at 3.9 in Chief Exec's report about the ICB office space and a HQ at County Hall and some more second site here at the HIC in Lancaster. I probably will ask a question on this, and this is about actually the board meetings. And is there any intention, I think, to perhaps move these board meetings further around Lancashire and South Cumbria, so that members of the public do have that opportunity to be able to come and see this board making those decisions, seeing this board in action, and seeing the work that we're doing, and again I reiterate the positive work that's going on, and as I say, that is quite clearly shown within this report. So again, I welcome it, Kevin. I think it's really important that we continue to have this report coming to the board. I know it's the first one that you've done, but again, we appreciate it, I'm sure, and thanks for the work on it, and we look forward to seeing more of them in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. Very helpful. Jim.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I welcome the report as well. Pretty straightforward question, mine. Pleased to see the place-based partnerships people have been appointed. When are they taking up post?
I haven't got that at my fingertips. I think Claire Richardson in Blackburn is the latest. It's sort of in November. Jane's already here, and I think with Louise and Karen, we'll have probably some part-timing to begin with to get it moving. So there are already. I mean, we had a meeting of Jeff's group a couple of weeks back. We've got one coming up, I think, next week. So they are starting to participate now, but they will be gradually phasing in, depending on, the arrangements with particularly Lancs and Blackpool. But I think with them both being on the patch, they're getting involved now. And could I just comment on Roy's point about, I mean, it's David's decision and your decision as a board about travelling around the county, but I think we're generally up for that. But we just got to have mindful of getting the technology right. It's not easy with this size group, and we do need, you know, the webcasting and all of that. So I think we probably want to identify 3 or 4 locations where we're comfortable we can do that practically. That's all.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you. Sheena?
Yeah, just to echo others' input about this being a really helpful report. Clearly, we're still very much in the setup phase, and I think it's incredibly impressive how much has been done in a very short space of time. So congratulations to Kevin and the team for that. One of the things about just trying to work out how we kind of all the bits of the jigsaw fit together is just to kind of understand the relationship between the Place Development Steering Group and the Delivery Board, both of which I think are really, really important developments. But it's really how that's going to work. And I'm thinking particularly we might want to pick this through into the deep dive next month on the urgent care and emergency care report, and how the different, you know, yeah, absolutely, yeah, just so we've got that clarity, because both are really important in relation to that, particularly when we're looking at thinking very differently about our response to people's needs, which obviously the place-based development's really important. Thank you.
I think 2 things really. One, just in terms of progress. On the negative side, we've had really, when you look back at the pathfinder for the ICS and then becoming the ICB, and we had Amanda leaving probably more than a year ago. We had interim leadership. I arrived quite late, March. Then we had to quickly sort out structures and stuff like that. So we've been moving at pace. But actually, if you look at it from a staff point of view, they've been dangling for a very, very long period of time with a lot of uncertainty around them. At the same time, we are shortly going to do the NHS staff satisfaction survey. That will be challenging for obvious reasons. So I just want to put it on the table. I think we've got to look at that as an opportunity. Let's get it all out on the table and let's have a real focus around that. But it will be a challenge. I know James has got some early work on leadership development within the ICB workforce, and clearly communications is going to be another area. But I just want you to clock that we will have some. I think it'll be bad news, but we've got to actually treat that as a good thing and get to the bottom of it, do something about it, because they have had a really long extended period of uncertainty. In terms of the roles of some of the groups, now, I think in all honesty we're still working some of those things out, but Jeff wants to come in on that. What we are clear on the delivery board, it's looking after a small number of things where we've got formalised projects with proper structures coming together around them, so it's quite tight and restricted, if that makes sense. Probably there are some other governance areas, Sheena, around how it relates to things like the Get It Right First Time programme, the broader transformation programmes and all of that. And I think probably that is something we don't have the answers to all of that yet, but I think this is something we should talk to you about, probably in a workshop format going forward, if that makes sense.
James, do you want to add?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's worth on that in terms of the work around the transformation programme. So Sarah, myself, David, I've got some time actually later today with a number of colleagues to start to look at how that infrastructure comes together. And then Sheena, you and I have actually got a session on transformation strategy tomorrow afternoon, haven't we? So the intention is that we can get your input early into that following the meeting today. So.
Thanks, James. Got Kevin, then Jeff.
Thanks, David. And as colleagues have said, I think it's a really good report. I think it's great that it's actually out into the public domain. And I think it's a really helpful report in terms of being able to cascade messages through individual organisations and boards and the wider system. So you can see this report being used for very many and different purposes. Just one specific point I just want to pick up on. It's a little bit of a nuance, but I think it's important. In the short-term financial stability under 3.8 and the various programmes, that first programme is defined as reducing unfunded additional acute capacity. What it's really focusing on is trying to right-size both our in and out of hospital capacity one of the outcomes of which will be the ability then to close unfunded acute capacity. So it's a nuance, but I think it's really important because it is about how do we right-size both in and out of hospital capacity.
Just to come back, I'm chuckling a little bit, only because I agree completely. It's about the connection between the hospital and the wider community, and we're really struggling to find the words to describe that, and they've been changing constantly, haven't they? So I think getting the right words, that it's not just about the hospital, but it's actually about the community and the connection between the two would be really helpful.
Got Jeff, then David, then Debbie, please.
Thank you, Chair. Two points, if I may. First of all, on the report itself, it's a bit of an expansion of what Kevin was saying. I think it's a really useful place to bring together relevant information. And it is in the public domain, but clinicians generally don't access this sort of stuff, you know, and there's lots of excuses, but they don't. So, and I'm sure Neil, who's in the audience, will be all over this, but to make sure this goes into the newsletters across the patch in all the different places for clinicians to pick up, whether it's acute or community or general practice, would be really important, I think, to sell the message from the board. The second thing I wanted to say about place-based partnerships, of course, we're evolving, and we're evolving under your guidance, Kevin, and the point that Sheen has made about connecting with other groups is vital. And one of the ways we've operated in the past is to try and liaise with other groups. And the groups that strike me as really important would be the clinical and care professional leadership under David Levy and the provider collaborative, Kevin, and others. So the proposal, though it's not agreed yet, will be that obviously we can't have everybody in a committee trying to develop places, but the core group will want to reach out to all these groups when relevant agenda items arise. Might be finance. We've had Sam before to our meeting, haven't we? Etc. So the group will be very much live and interactive with other groups as is needed. And if we don't do it, tell me off. Thank you.
Well done, Jeff. David, then Debbie.
Thank you. So thanks for the report, Kevin. Yes, it's really good and should help people really understand where we're at. And, you know, getting this on a regular basis will be really helpful for people. I think we do need to think about how we translate it into something that is palatable for people and easy for them to digest. Two points, and it's actually from the appendix. One is about the safeguarding arrangements and just double checking what the interface will be between the Integrated Care Board and the safeguarding boards that we have across Lancashire and South Cumbria. So what's the mechanism for that interface is my first question. And the second one is around the liberty protection safeguards. We've got, you know, some real changes coming down the line which have got a huge impact on lots of organisations around this table, not least my own. But what are we doing to prepare for that? Do we have a working group that's kind of looking at that? Is that connecting with the local authorities as well? So,
Thanks, David. Sarah, do you want? Yes, please.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Really important point. I mean, I think in terms of safeguarding, the from an ICB and our statutory role, we are represented in all the safeguarding boards as one of the 3 statutory partners across the patch. And safeguarding reports into Quality Committee at the moment. So in terms of connecting the work of the boards to this board, that is through the Quality Committee and the reporting that will go there. Clearly, you know, there's a decision to be made about whether annually an annual report on safeguarding needs to come here or whether we just bring things here by exception. So that's how we will connect the safeguarding. And longer run, I would be keen to see the designated professionals that we have to have from a health point of view, working in a very integrated way at place with IROs from the local authority and the safeguarding adults teams as well. So that's how we'll link those things. In terms of the liberty protection, you're right, it's big change. So at the moment, we've got some of our adult safeguarding nurses starting to look at that as it comes through. We're connected to the regional work on that. I don't think there's a working group as such at this stage. It's something I'll pick up with the leads on that, but our designated professionals are starting to interpret that new guidance, look at it, and already work very closely with their counterparts in the local authorities, looking at the implications of that for us.
And Debbie, please.
Thanks, David. So I thought it was a brilliant report. I think it's really well written, and I liked the language as well. I found myself not having to Google very much and look things up. I think one of the things we do have to think about is the public will see papers, and it might be that moving forward we might want to either signpost to or have a glossary of terms. It's always best if we don't use the terms in the first place, but it's kind of almost like a backup. I think that'd be really helpful. So a comment and a question, if that's okay. So the comment around the discussion about us moving board meetings around, I think it's really important. And I think when we're looking at venues, if we can look at IT accessibility, but if we can also look at public transport accessibility. I'm not sure how easy it is to get here. I've driven today, but if people wanted to come by bus, by train, could they actually make it? So if we can factor that into the decision making when we're looking at venues, that would be brilliant. And then the question was around 3.2, so I think it's you again, probably James, about the ICB OD programme. So welcomed the high-level information. I know it's really early days, but again, it's fantastic and reassuring that OD is recognised as a critical priority. Can you just update us or touch on how you're involving staff in developing that programme? I just know from experience that if you develop things with staff, if things are developed by staff, they're often anchored, valued and more impactful than if they're sort of seen as being developed at distance.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we're embarking on a really quite ambitious and innovative approach, I think, to this. So we've done quite a bit of work. So this is specifically at the moment for the ICB OD programme. There's also a separate piece of work that we're working up with the Provider Collaborative and increasingly other partners. I'm meeting with local authority colleagues to discuss this as well later this month. But we're also doing a piece of work for an ICS system-wide OD programme. This focuses on the ICB one. So in relation to the ICB programme, we're over the next 8 weeks, we're actually going to be taking the entire extended leadership team. That's 41 people through a process of one-to-one interviews with the Leadership Academy and also self-assessments, so that we're going to build up a full baseline review of where everybody is in relation to current strengths. We're using a new prototype that we're working with to develop through the Leadership Academy. So we're going to, and that work then comes together at the end of October, and we're going to use that work, use those one-to-one interviews, use the outputs from the self-assessments to design the formal part of the programme, so it's completely orientated around what comes out. So it's not an off-the-shelf piece of work. We're developing and tailoring it for the ICB, so it's really quite exciting. And on that basis, the Northwest Leadership Academy are looking to then use that with the other two ICBs. So we're kind of in from the beginning in relation to this. So I'm really quite excited. Neil's working with us from the comms team on it. I've got a paper with Neil going to the ICB execs next week to kind of set all this out. So yeah, we're really quite exciting.
And Kevin?
Just quickly on the venues point, we will look at venues. Some of them are pretty obvious. A lot of the council chambers and things like that, which are good in terms of the IT. They're accessible for public transport and walking and cycling and all that sort of stuff, but also really good in terms of disabled access and things of that kind as well. So, you know, Lancashire County Council will be one of the venues we're looking at, and Blackpool and Blackburn and Kendal, those sorts of places, yeah.
Thank you. Just on that, then, are we all in agreement with the principle that we'll move around the patch, make ourselves more visible and accessible? And I think it's an opportunity also for us to combine moving around with being able, in part of the day, if the scheduling works, for us to visit local services and so on and do that. That'd be good. Okay, we'll take that on. Thank you. We've got Tracy next, and then Jane, please.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you, Kevin. Just to echo a really clear report and also really good discussions that will help me translate some of this into communications for the voluntary community sector. So thank you for those discussions as well. I just wanted to pick up on something quite specific within the report, which is around winter planning and the plan for the paper to come to the next board. We've already heard from David and others about the kind of urgency at the moment within our communities around cost of living crisis and around some of the things that are happening within communities and happening to individuals at the moment. And obviously it's very high profile in the media as well. I think I just wanted to convey that sense of urgency, really, that we need this winter report. We need to understand the investment and how this is going to work within our communities. But also, I just wanted to ask a question about, we've moved away from the CCG model to a kind of ICB strategic investment model, as I understand it, in terms of resources. I don't want to lose some of what is happening in communities and what potentially could be invested in communities, that because I think a lot of the solutions around winter pressures exist at that community level. And Kevin, you talked about, more beds, and absolutely, you know, we can all understand why that investment is completely necessary. But I also just wondered what within this plan there's going to be around those other wider determinants of health, the things that we know are really affecting people's health and well-being, that are going to put a lot of pressures on the NHS and on social care, not just in the winter, they are already doing that. And how we build in a little bit of innovation into this plan in terms of how we're going to address some of these issues.
That's a big question. Look, I think the first thing is just, and Kevin McGee, you might want to come in on this as well. First of all, it's fantastic that the NHS has actually come out with some early decisions. These normally come out much closer to Christmas. And I think the fact that we've had early sight of it gives us a bit more chance. The reason that's happened, though, is because people are deeply concerned. This is going to be a very, very, very challenging winter. COVID has been difficult in the summer, never mind the winter, but what's it going to be like in the winter? People are worried about flu. They've looked at what's happened in Australia. And of course, you've got the cost of living crisis as well. So you've got like a triple whammy. It's very welcome to have £20 million extra. And we have got a lot of people who've been doing this in the CCG world, doing it with the hospital teams now. So I'm confident that we've got lots of people who know what they're doing. I think we probably have to focus very much on short-term actions to really make a fast difference this year, but actually we mustn't lose sight of that strategic. And so something like Finney House is a good example. We want 30-odd beds this year to make a difference there in terms of getting people out of the hospital system to release more, to do the right thing for patients who need treatment. But actually in the longer term, we need to transform that intermediate service as well. So it's sort of, there's a two-step approach here. I think we've got a lot of people involved working together as a team. It won't be perfect this year. We're going to be under tremendous pressure, and I think we need to be realistic about that. Kevin, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I mean, it's a really important point that you've raised, and I think it's also fair to say what we've concentrated on for the moment is probably the traditional NHS capacity and how we can increase that additional NHS capacity. But within each of our local systems, so our A&E delivery boards, we do have voluntary sector, third sector, strong representation, and the conversations are now evolving about, so what more can we do? If we can put our resources into the traditional, but there's more that we can do in terms of linking with communities, linking with the voluntary sector, we're absolutely open for those conversations. And I think the route is through the A&E delivery boards, because that gets into the local conversations in each of the local systems. And I think we're really open to those conversations, because just to reiterate what Kevin has said, I think it is going to be a really difficult winter. We have not got all the answers, if we're frank, within the NHS alone, and we have to work with the coalition of our communities, the voluntary sector and other agencies to try and protect our communities as much as we can. So I think that's the route through the A&E delivery boards.
Thank you, Kevin. I think that Roy's point from earlier as well about how quickly we can get the place-based work operating on is going to be vital for all of this. I'll come to you, Abdul. I've got Jane next, and then Angie.
Thank you, Chair. It's a follow-up question for James, really. You've partly answered it, because I'm really pleased to see the emphasis on the organisation development programme, because it's absolutely key, isn't it, around culture and leadership. I was going to ask, are you including the wider partnership? And you said you were, but just to develop that thinking a little bit, I think what's absolutely key here is we've got across the partnership a commitment to systems working, systems leadership, collaborative working, same sort of shared values and behaviours across the piece as much as we can, because actually, to pick up on Kevin's point, that's what we're going to need if we're going to get different agencies working together. So the more we can think of them as one integrated piece of work, actually, rather than this is for the ICB and this is for the wider system, the more we could start to, right from the outset, to have that kind of vision in mind, I think that will pay dividends, really.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. Absolutely, absolutely. Just to be absolutely clear, the distinction is only one of the system work is going to take a longer time. There's a longer lead-in and time frame, and of course we've got some quite urgent OD challenges within the ICB, given, as Kevin said, the length of time that staff have been hanging for a while. So I think it's more of a timescale thing rather than two different programs. You're absolutely right, and the system OD program will be a complete system one. In fact, I've got a session with Kevin Moynes next week from the Provider Collaborative to talk about how we ensure that it captures and enhances the work that's already going on within the Provider Collaborative in terms of OD. We've got conversations around primary care, because there's a lot of requirement for OD and support in terms of primary care as well. And of course we were discussing, Sarah, David and I were discussing the OD input required to the emergent multidisciplinary clinical leadership model as well yesterday. So you're absolutely right. It will be a whole encompassing programme which will be moving forward with all system partners. But there's some very immediate work that we need to do in terms of the ICB just to move us on as an organisation. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Angie?
Thanks very much. So I'll just pick up two comments, then I want to just talk a little bit about the winter pressures, the cost of living issues that we have at the moment. So firstly, I thought the report was really helpful. I direct all of my colleagues to read it because I think it gives them a really good view of what's going on. Abdul and I do summarise it and give them some views, but if they do nothing else, I encourage my colleagues to read your report, Kevin, because I think it's a really good insight into what's happening in the system. Second comment is about the OD issues and the difficulties that all staff across the system, but particularly senior staff in the NHS, have faced during this transformation. It has been really difficult for people. I think I've seen real professionalism in the way that people have conducted themselves and engaged with that change, and I think we should formally recognise and thank the staff as a board for how they've conducted themselves during this time, because I think they've been exemplary. And then just more fundamentally, in terms of the winter pressures, as you would expect within local government, we've already kicked off a range of work to look at how we can support our communities to address the issues that are going to be coming down the track. Notwithstanding the noise in the system and the media and the fact that there are some people already impacted, we're just at the foothills of what's going to happen, and we're planning for a rising tide of issues to come our way. So what we're trying to do is to get ahead of the system and start working, and we will be engaging with the VCFS, and we need to engage more closely with the NHS, but engaging with our communities about how they can help and support themselves. So things like making sure they're maximising all of the benefits that they can access. We know we've already got lots of warm spaces identified, we've got food banks identified, but they're not going to be practical for working families in many ways. What we do need to do, I think, as our plans materialise over the next couple of weeks, is to really engage with the NHS and community and voluntary sector to make sure that we're all pulling in the same direction. And I also need to take an action from here to engage with South Cumbria to make sure that they're engaged in that, because we have a common theme. But actually, while we might not have all of our structures in the place-based partnerships, worked out yet, we can actually use this as a game changer to actually bed some of those in practice, because obviously on the NHS side you often respond. We've got to work together to try and minimise that demand on response, so trying to get upstream. So I think there's a real opportunity here to build on the work that's already been commissioned. Thank you.
Thanks, Angie. I've got Maggie to come, but Abdul, while we're on this, do you want to add?
Thank you very much, Chairman, really. And I'd just like to echo what Angie said, really. There are good examples already, really, of work actually happening within local government, really. And Kevin and Sam were actually at our Health and Wellbeing Board in Blackwell and Darwen last evening, really, and we gave an update on the cost of living crisis. We've been working on this within our patch for the last 4 or 5 months. And we are working really through the A&E Delivery Board, as Kevin has actually mentioned. So we feel as though we've got good integration, great relationships to actually build on, and clearly we want to sustain the community and individual resilience of our local communities and residents as we go forward into what might be a difficult period for the foreseeable future, not just this winter, but slightly beyond as well. So I know that there are great exemplars. 2 points, really, if I may, just building upon Angie, really. The first one really is, would it be useful to actually bring clear examples, really, of great work, integration work that's already happening within our systems? And that's the first issue. And the second issue, really, was on place-based partnerships. Please don't forget the population health management approach and our public health collaborative that I chair on behalf of Directors of Public Health as well, as part of that work, because I see really that the population health management approach clearly has a great place to actually play within the challenges ahead. On the community of voluntary sector point, we've already invested £2 million through the population health investments of the ICB in relation to this, and that's going to go directly to PCNs to actually help with, and an element of that is around social vulnerability. So what we're doing with the Blackwell and Darwen, for example, is integrating some of that pathway within primary care with our wellbeing services and our social prescribers as a clear example of making sure that the community services are actually integrated and connected as we go through some of the social as well as healthcare needs during this period of time. Thank you so much.
It's very helpful, thank you. I've got Maggie, and then we'll have Jeff, and then a last word from Roy, and I'll move us on.
Thanks, David. And gosh, this has been really great conversation, but particularly on this last issue for me around the winter. And please forgive my ignorance, I don't really start till Monday, so Kevin will nudge me if I say anything incorrect. But I do believe this will be falling into my, winter planning will be in my portfolio. So I'd really love to be able to spend some time, Tracy, with you, Angie, Abdul. I just think this is such an opportunity to be innovative in the way that you've described. So yes, we've got traditional things that we've always done that give us the same results that we've always had, but this new board and this opportunity to actually do things differently is something that I really want to drive at pace. And, you know, being really conscious of the effect that we have. So everything we do, the £2 million, what effect does it have and where does it have it? How do we measure the outcomes for our communities? And then working with Kevin about what's the visible impact that we can see. I don't think we've been able to do that very well in the past. But yeah, I think next week, watch out for the email.
Well done, Maggie. Jeff, please.
Thank you, Chair. Two points, if I may. Quickly, in answer to you, Abdul, the place-based development group, whatever we call ourselves in the end, has a place for the lead for population health within the group, Dr. Andy Knox, who will well sell the cause of that. Talking about winter pressures, I think Abdul and Angie and Kevin have alluded to all this, but I'll just say it again in a different way, and that is we can respond as a system, and we must activate our places and our place-based leaders as soon as possible to do that, working with Maggie. But there's no substitute for me for asking the people who live in the communities, what is it that we could do that would help you most? And that will be different in every community, and every community structure is slightly different. And I think you're doing all that, but I'm just saying it because I think it just needs to be said. And you know, there's going to be a difficulty in primary care, you know, my area, and access will be difficult. And I think we need to have a look and work with primary care leaders about what could primary care do to prioritise the people who are most vulnerable and in need. Because we won't be able to solve the whole access problem overnight or over a year or over maybe not over a decade, who knows. But we need to be mindful that the vulnerable need that access. And I think there's a conversation needed around that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Well made, and Roy.
Thanks, thanks, Chair. Just to perhaps follow on from Abdul and Jeff's comments as well. I think colleagues around the table may recall that last year we had something called the Winter Access Fund that CCGs were given money from to increase access, I think, to primary care was one of the main points of that, but also to increase the resilience of the urgent care system by expanding the same-day urgent care capacity. And I think that was done really well at that time. And I think there can be lessons learned from some of the things that we did by involving the community sector as well, Tracy, as well. I think certainly I recall that happening in Blackpool and the surrounding area. But it also talked about the uses of that fund, and it was about local systems being able to determine the optimal use of that funding. And I think it's right and proper that perhaps we should also, and I do understand, you know, that this report will be coming back to our next meeting, but I think it's right and proper that we perhaps consider how that fund was used in the past, where that best optimal use was determined and pointed at. And I think it's those local issues, local solutions that have been found, I think, by using that fund that have actually helped those areas to improve that access to primary care and access to urgent care, that I think would be really helpful for us as a strategic board. Okay, thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Roy. Kevin, thank you. I think fair to say the report's very well received, and a number of issues have come out that will thread us all the way through the winter, and indeed some of them is beyond, so it helps us, thank members, it helps us frame how we go forward from here. One of the things that for me the report also helps us do is as a system level board, it's quite easy for us to conduct business which doesn't feel in touch with the day-to-day business, and but in the contributions everybody's made, it's about the reality of life that colleagues in the system, the health and care system beyond us are facing. One of the things we've talked about, Sarah, also is how we bring more direct discussion in around patient stories and so on. You refer to, I don't know where we're up to with thinking about that. Will we be doing that at the next meeting?
The aim, Neil and I are working on that. The aim is to start with patient stories from the next meeting in October, and we're also going to be doing the same with Quality Committee.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good. Right. Let's move on in the agenda. Sam, finance report, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. So I suppose this report, which I'm going to take you through now, what you'll see in it is there is a lot of challenge and a lot of financial risk, and I'm just going to take you through the highlights. But all the way through it, I think it feeds into the last discussion we've just had, really, is there is a real focus and effort going into a number of big pieces of work that really start to change the dial, and that's what's really important for us to be focusing on in here. So, yes, we've got to balance the books and we've got to deliver what we need to this year, but I think it's going to be really important that we don't take our eye off the ball. So if I could give an example of something we've just talked about, and I think Tracy's point was really important in this, if we're given winter funding and winter capacity funding, to just bring that in and put more beds in because there's more people needing beds would be the wrong thing to do. If we can do that to support people to come out of some of those really intense beds coming into something that's a step down, but then think about how do we pump prime that as a model going forward, working with our partners, that's a much better approach. So what you'll see in the paper are a number of programmes, and we laughed before because we're calling it reducing temporary capacity, but in here we call it system, I think we call it, what do we call it, system flow. So, but what we're really talking about is how do we transform that, and it fits into that transformation agenda. So it's really important, I think people understand that as we go through this report. So the report really describes the financial performance to the end of July. I'm just going to pick out the highlights. And the first 3 months, of course, were delivered through our CCGs. So this is sort of 1 month of our performance, and as we've picked it up, but 4 months into the year. So at the end of July, the system is 12.4 million off plan. And that's largely due to the slippage on savings plans and additional temporary staffing pressures that we're seeing throughout the system, really. And you can see that reflecting itself in the run rate as well, that's at 2.7% compared to last year. Now, savings plans of 40 million have been delivered so far, but they're £11 million plan, and that's what's sort of triggering a lot of the pressure in the system. And operational pressures are continuing to bring challenges in the delivery of some of these plans. And the system does, though, remain focused on both to be really focused on the things that we need them to do. But we are making some progress in that area, but it's not fast enough. So 40 million is great, but we needed 51. So that's where we are on some of that. What we've been doing across the system, which I think has been really, really helpful, all the trusts, all the providers are working with us across the system on this, is we've developed a roadmap of all the different CIP plans that internal organisations have got, as well as those system-wide schemes. And we've mapped that against the original risk to where we could get to at the end of the year. And bringing that 178 million, looking at that real risk, we've assessed that down to about a £70 million risk, but it still requires a lot of action to get us to a balanced position by the end of the year. But there's progress being made. It's not enough, but it's going in the right direction in terms of the risk. The 5 areas of the system delivery are outlined in section 5 of the report, and you can see that first portfolio 1 or programme 1 is the system flow area. And the impact of those schemes are all impacting and being considered in that roadmap, with the focus and approach now to say how do we get real recurrent balance as we're developing these things. So it remains really challenging, but the focus has got to be on recurrence. So I hold assurance meetings with all of the provider trusts. We go through the CIP plans as part of that. And I've been asking for, through the Directors of Finance and into their boards, for real focus on recurrent plans. And we're trying to develop those as we're going through the year. What you'll see in the report, and I think it was Debbie that sort of brought this up at the last board, and we've been doing some work, and it might be that Sarah or Sheena would like to comment on this, but the quality team have done a lot of work sort of developing that quality and equality impact assessment on all of these schemes. Now, we know all of our trusts have their own schemes and their own processes, and that's all in place, but the system, at the system level, we do have new templates and processes in place to look at that. And then in the paper, what you'll see in there is I've included a section on the mental health investment. And I think it's really important because there has been some media coverage about potential reductions in mental health funding in light of the challenges we're facing as a system. And I just wanted to take the opportunity to clarify really that mental health remains at the heart of our strategy and plans. And we want to make the right change for our population. We can't do it without mental health. That's never gone away, and it doesn't, it's still a core priority for us. And the system for many years has continued to invest in mental health. The mental health investment standard was created to ensure parity, and the investment had to be at least the level of growth plus some, and that was every year, and we've continued to develop that and deliver that. And that's an audited process as well, so we have continued to do that. Temporary funding has been provided for the impact of COVID for all of our organisations, and we've seen that in supporting the out-of-area placements that we've seen in mental health, and that has been driven by the fact, largely in mental health, we've seen a real increase in out-of-area placements because dormitories had to be shut because of the IPC guidelines around COVID, and we had to we went through which is a really positive move, to go through the refurbishment of those dormitories. And in doing so, that had an impact on our out-of-areas, so there was COVID non-recurrent funding supporting that. We're working really closely now with the mental, and we have been for a long time, but we're working really closely with the Mental Health Trust to look at how do we eradicate out of areas, because they're not great for anybody and we don't want to see them. And now we're really the dormitories are opening up, the capacity's coming back in. So there hasn't been any cuts to any contracts, but there has been pressures in that trust, as there has been across all of our providers. And when we went through the planning round, the 5% SIPs and the sort of risk that we talked about before was across the board, and everybody's been treated in the same way around that. that. So Mental Health Trust has been part of that in exactly the same way. So I guess in summary, we've got some really big ongoing challenges. We're doing everything we can to try and balance this plan. The risk has come down in the right direction, but there's an awful lot of work just to get us to that point. And as we've been listening, there are all of these pressures that we're expecting around winter and COVID and the impact of the cost of living, and all those things are going to play in. So we are where we are, but we're doing our very best. I think the core thing for me is focusing on that recurrent plan and making sure that we're not storing up a bigger problem for us next year. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Sam. Just on a clarification point first. Clearly, the delivery of the plan is more about control of expenditure now. We pretty much know what the basic. And in section 3 on your report, we talk about them. The 3 trusts stand out as higher than expected rates of increase in income at Morecambe Bay, at the Mental Health Trust, but very significantly at Blackpool. And although you make reference in 3.3 to Blackpool, that number's so big. I mean, can you just give us a bit more feel for what's going on there? Anybody who's spending 8% to 9% more this year than you spent last is heading for trouble. What's the context for that?
So I think through the assurance meetings, this obviously is a focus, and we've been particularly looking at Blackpool. So during both the month 3 and the month 4 assurance meetings, we've had a focus on this, and it links directly to quite a significant increase in temporary staffing. Originally over June with the 2 bank holidays and a number of other pressures that were emerging in some of their services. What we are told by Blackpool is that there are a lot of grip and control going in around this, and that we're expecting to see that reduce back down. So it shouldn't be a recurrent, it's linked to non-recurrent temporary staffing. So that's what's driving it, but we're yet to see that come down. It's actually maintained at quite a high level for the last month. There are some things that we need to check out with Blackpool around, is there anything impacting on this that's around non-recurrent income that's offsetting it, but I'm not aware at the moment around anything else, so it's mainly around the temporary staffing.
Yeah, it's very unusual, I think, for temporary staffing in the summer to be able to be taken out in the winter. I think, Kevin, there's just something about a closer understanding of all that, because that sort of percentage is in danger of screwing the whole plan over. Yeah. Do you want to add any more about the mental health position?
I think Sam's made it clear, really, just to be crystal clear for the public record, given the media coverage. Effectively, we've had a standstill budget across the system. In mental health, we've had increased investment through the mental health investment standards. We've honoured that. The challenges here are really around expenditure control with rising demand for services. That's the issue. But as a system, we've treated mental health just as we have all the other trusts, but they've had the mental health investment on top of that, which has been protected, just to be really, really crystal clear.
Thank you. Angie, and then welcome a perspective on this from you, Kevin, please.
Thank you. So I thought it was a really helpful and clear report, so thanks very much, Sam. Just a couple of questions from my perspective. We've talked about the cost of living crisis, and certainly for local authorities, our recast budgets are showing, I mean, for next year, I'm looking at a trebling of my deficit, my forecast deficit, as a result of the cost of living crisis. Now, we'll be in a different place, because I think we're in a different place with pay settlements and things like that, but it's not all driven by pay. So I'd really like some assurance as to how the current inflationary pressures, particularly around energy and other provisions, are factored into the forecast or bend. So my question to you is, what do you need from the board to help the system reduce this forecast overspend? Because it's hard to see from the current perspective that we will achieve within our envelope at the end of the year, and that will obviously have consequences for us. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll come back to you, Sam, so you can think about that. I think there's I don't think there's an inevitability about the overspend, Angie, but I think that there's significant issues still to think about in the risk management. So we'll come back to Sam on your question. Welcome a perspective from Kevin and a view from Jim.
Thanks, David. I mean, I suppose from a good news perspective, Sam has led significant work with the providers over the last couple of months to really get behind the figures, to understand the figures, and to really understand the extent of the risk. And that risk has come down significantly from a figure that was over 170 million to one that's around about 70 million. Still incredibly large, but a significant movement, and we need to recognise that, and the work that's been done across the system, led by Sam, in terms of getting hold of those figures. From a provider perspective, we absolutely have not given up on this. We are continuing to push. We are going to look for every bit of expediency that we can this year in terms of bringing that number down, and we will continue to do so. And we will continue to challenge ourselves and have peer-to-peer challenges in terms of overspends and more work that can be done. So I would expect that figure of 70 million to come down. I wouldn't want to put a figure in terms of what it will come down to, but we're still aiming to try and break even. It will be incredibly hard, but that's still our objective, and we're not giving up on that. I think, though, that the point that Sam has raised, which is the really fundamental point, because, you know, if we get through this year, and we get through on the basis of non-recurrent savings, but we've not put in the recurrent transformation, all we'll be doing is creating a further problem into next year. So what's really important, where we are focusing our time and energy, are what are going to be the big transformational schemes that will allow us to reduce our cost base on a recurrent basis and deliver differently for the future. And that's where the majority of the energy and the effort needs to happen, because that's then not just about finances, that's also about the transformation of the system that will give us the quality and safety changes that we want to see, and allow us to not have the reliance on the temporary staffing that we see right throughout our system. So I don't underestimate this, David. This is going to be incredibly hard, but from a provider perspective, both in terms of the non-recurrent and the push this year, but also the recurrent changes that are going to be necessary, we are absolutely focused on this, and I can really assure the board of that.
Thank you, Kevin. Jim?
Yeah, thanks. I think a number of the comments that I would have made have been made by both Angie and Kevin, which were both very helpful. I'm encouraged to see that the scale of the risk is reduced, but remain concerned that there's little or no evidence of anything significant being achieved in terms of addressing the current problem. It's interesting that Kevin... it's interesting that Kevin mentioned about the work they're doing on transformation projects. It would be good to see that at this board meeting, I think. That would give us some assurance that there is work going on to address the problem on a recurrent basis, which I'm not confident that's happening. You raised the issue about specific organisations, and you mentioned the point about spectating. I think that's the same point in a sense. We're not seeing enough depth at this point in time. The organisation is only 2 months old, so, you know, why would you expect to have any more than that? But at some point, we've got to get into this in a lot more detail, I think. And I know discussions are taking place about how we do that. It can't be done necessarily around this table, but somebody needs to be doing it on our behalf and presenting to us a bit more detail, because at this point in time, you wonder how we're going to get to anywhere close to a recurrent balance position, and that's worrying for the organisation, because we know there's a whole new set of challenges to come next year, including, you know, when I talk to Sam, we're going to have more money taken off us from a resource allocation perspective. I doubt whether inflation...
I mean, it isn't also an unusual year in that we've had this first 3 months. At some point, it would be good. I know we need to look forward into managing the situation as you've all described. But at some point, we had a 3-month CCG budget. Was that budget met? Was it underspent? Was it overspent? You know, in terms of where what the final CCG accounts are going to look like for that period. We'll hold on to that. I've got a few more. Kevin, do you want to come in at this point, and then I've got others to come?
Look, I just first of all, in terms of the CCGs, we've got the close down, etc. I think at the next board meeting. So, you know, you'll formally consider that. Second point to make is a bit of good news. The pay award's fully funded. That's really, really important. That would have been a nightmare had it not been fully funded. Third point is, Jim, we are concerned. We are worried. It's improved. We are worried, and I just want to be clear on that. We have got some major projects. We've talked a little bit about whatever we call it, discharge and social care, and some real projects that are happening there that will make a difference this year. The other area, which we'll talk about later in part 2, is around agency and staffing, where we're going through a process where we will see in-year differences made and reductions at a time, because winter's the time when those costs potentially go through the roof, so it's not a standard spend throughout the year, where we think we can make a real difference this year. We have now started to populate the shared services programme. We've got a leader from outside who's done this many times in different organisations, who will be in post in October. That's a project that's really important to kick off, but it will not really deliver much this year, but it hopefully will make a real difference next financial year. Our intention is to come back with reports on all of these things, but we want to make sure we've got some substance, and you know, we've just been born, and we're desperately trying to run and get these projects up and running. I think the first one will be the project that Kevin is sponsoring on discharge and care in the community. We'll then come back on the agency, and then we'll have a report on shared services. So it is absolutely our intention to do that, but we do want some substance around it rather than just good ideas, real traction and real plans around it.
Thank you. We've got a few more. I'll go around, and then we'll come back, Sam, for you for the last word. David, then Abdul.
Okay, thank you. In Sam's report, under the delivery board is portfolio 3, and I just want to unpack it for a moment, just because Kevin is right. We need to do that transformational work as well. It's fine to try and take money out, but in fact there is an unwarranted variation in pathways across some of our hospitals, for example. And in the last week, so it could go into this paper, we've had some very helpful discussions with the medical directors and others, particularly about the Get It Right First Time programme, where in fact this is a national programme. It's not very well aligned with ICBs or with NHS England or the regions. But we have identified that there are significant opportunities there if we take some of the very high volume pathways, and we've agreed with the medical directors, because we have to do this as a partnership piece of work, that there be 4 pathways we'd be looking at, one of them being orthopaedics, for example. And also the level of our ambition is to really move in the first year to get Lancashire and South Cumbria certainly into the middle of the pack, if we're not there already, and then to get further improvements. And we've seen, for example, at Morecambe Bay, where they've done this for one elective pathway, which is for hip replacement, they saved over 1,000 bed days. So there are significant benefits. But what we need to do is working with the medical directors, ensure that we've got our priority pathways, we've got that clinical engagement. Again, the medical directors can help us with that. The project management support. There is a team available to us in Lancashire South Cumbria to deliver this work, and frankly, we just need to crack on with it and report back on progress in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Very encouraging, Abdul.
Thank you very much, Chairman. From a population health perspective, really, I think as a mitigation, really, to the report that Sam presents, really, I would say really 2 things. Really, we do need to double up, really, and re-energise our efforts, which we are doing around COVID vaccination rates for the winter period, because clearly that will mitigate some of the kind of unmet the need that in terms of acute activity and within primary care. The other one clearly has been mentioned around flu vaccination rates. So I think a big push really on an intervention that clearly mitigate some of the demand that's coming through our primary community and social care, as well as acute care, would be. We need the highest rates really possible in each of those 2 programmes, and we need to really give it a massive drive from the ICB board from a population health perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. And Maggie?
Thanks, David. And really good debate, I think, full stop, and great paper. I really look forward to being in this space alongside colleagues around the table as well, because I think what's really important is we have to spend every penny of the budget that we are allocated as close to our communities as absolutely possible. And when you look at some of the waste that we spend, particularly if you use temporary staffing as an example, we really have to risk stratify where we put our efforts and energies. And I really look forward to working with Kevin and others, James, on really understanding why and where we're using temporary staffing and what can we do to be innovative with our workforce to be able to spend the money much more wisely across the breadth of what we need to do. But again, can't wait for Monday to come to get involved in some of these conversations.
Thanks, Maggie. Jeff, then Sheena.
Thank you, Chair. Two things really. Yes, I think it's actually, to me, it's quite remarkable what you've done. I know there's a problem, but and I understand in a way the mental health overspend, because the burden from the extra demand is huge right across the acute sector, primary care, and the trust itself. So I don't like it, but I get it. But I don't so much get the Blackpool one. But we'll revisit that. I wanted to highlight a different risk and take this opportunity if I may, and it's around primary care. And that is, it doesn't feature in this conversation because primary care doesn't overspend. What happens with primary care is it gets its budget, and this is the wider primary care, but the focus in the public perception and the press will be general practice. Primary care doesn't overspend. What it does is it comes in on its budget, but eventually it does other things to meet that budget, and that will show in things like diminished service, less staffing, and less satisfaction with the service. That's the risk, and the bigger risk will be some practices saying, I've had enough and handing back my contract. And that's a real risk. And I think the board needs to be aware of that risk. People won't do that lightly, and it may not, and it won't happen en masse, but I see that risk as becoming more real. And of course, the profession may use that and ask for more money, but I think we need to, and I don't want to over-defend the profession, I'm not here to do that, but I just want to highlight, I do see that as a real risk. So the risk will appear in a different way. It won't appear on a balance sheet of money that we're going to overspend. It will appear in a change in the way the service is delivered.
Thanks, Jeff, and we'll hold on to that point for the discussion later on the primary care access. I've got Sheena, then I'll come back to you for the last word, Sam.
So just two things. First of all, just to pick up the quality impact assessment stuff, which is being set up over the last couple of months, and really positive work with Sarah and others in doing that. So that will come back through the quality committee in terms of any escalations, and obviously back to board if required. The second bit I just wanted to mention was to thank the team for the assurance about the mental health spend, and that's really helpful. And as we look forward, I think a real thread through our conversations today is our work with our communities, and particularly as we know that, you know, the impact of the context of people's lives at the moment, the increase in need, as Jeff and others have already said, around mental health needs that we need to really think about how do we support and come alongside our communities and ask and work with them about how can we help support improving what they need for their mental health well-being, and to really just to say that I've had a lot of really helpful and positive conversations the last couple of months with our third sector colleagues, and clearly that important role our third sector play in helping support that work. So just wanted to pull that through. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheena. It's very helpful. And sorry, Sam, before I come back to you, Tracy.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, again, thank you, Sam, for the report, and thank you for the discussions, really helpful in terms of translating some of this so I can communicate this to the voluntary sector. I think really for me, and you'll be well aware of this, but I suppose I just wanted to give an example that really puts a magnifying glass on the challenges around the kind of staffing situation. And I don't think you'll be unaware of this, but something that struck us as a service, and I'm talking about the service I run day to day, which is Citizens Advice in Blackpool, is that we've had a number of requests over the summer months, particularly from nurses who have wanted advice because they can't afford to put petrol in their car to get to work. And that is very unusual for us as a service to receive those from nurses. We've had a number of other inquiries from staff who work at Blackpool Hospital, but it really struck us as a service, and my vice service manager came to me with a very heartfelt email from a nurse at the hospital who was really struggling. So I think that it is slightly different this year, because I think we've never really experienced a crisis in terms of people's income to that level that they are struggling with some of the basic living daily costs. But from that, I just wanted to very quickly just explain some of the things that we've done, because we work closely with the hospital and they set up a financial resilience group for their staff. And a number of my staff went in, a couple of debt advisors, went into the hospital, delivered a few presentations around a whole range of support that's available in terms of maximising income, looking at how you can be more resilient, looking at the ways in which you can get support, grants, the things that are out there that can really help. So I suppose it's an example of how working together we could find some of those joint solutions, and I'm really keen to do that. But also I think it really plays into that challenge, Sam, that the system has around you know, managing the finances when actually against the backdrop of the issue we have with potentially staff going off sick because basically they just can't afford to get to work.
Sam, back to you.
Thank you, and thank you for all the comments, and that last comment is just another example of where working together is going to be the solution to this, and thank you for sharing that. I have heard that, and I know other trusts are doing similar things, so but it's really challenging, isn't it? I think, just to come back on a couple of points, I think that particularly that Angie raised, I think that cost of living impact, absolutely key, and you, as Kevin said, we are fortunate and we're pleased that the pay award is being fully funded. In terms of non-pay, there was a big part of the planning round that we did. We did identify some real pressures on non-pay. There was some additional funding given for non-pay, but I think that we're having more of a step change as we're moving through the year. So there are going to be continuing pressures on that without a doubt as we're moving into winter. I think on that sort of we're going off plan at the moment, yes, we are, and what we can see in the figures is some of that is reflecting that 70 million risk we've got, but some of it is grip and control, and some of it is about the timing of some of the savings plans coming in. We've got to catch up, and all the effort through these assurance meetings is about some of that corrective action to try and bring that back in line. So we have got to focus on that. And in terms of what do I need from people around the board, I think we've talked about so much of it today already, but it is about us all coming round and working together, because, you know, it's really interesting. Yesterday I went to 2 separate health and wellbeing boards, and in both of them I saw real opportunity. One was yours, Angie, in Lancaster, and the other was at Blackburn with Darwin. And I think both of those, I saw some real examples. So we had a big discussion around the Better Care Fund and how we could really make sure that is that being put in the right way? Are we using it effectively? Is it making the biggest difference that we can make to people? It's a really great opportunity, and as we get sort of place more developed and working in a more integrated way, we can think about how we can do much more of that, and including our voluntary sector colleagues and the wider partners in that. And then again in Blackburn with Darwin, we had a great example yesterday of working, you know, on population health, and there was a great presence there from the voluntary sector, and thinking about those things that we're going to hear next time in the board around how do we take this winter capacity and step down. How do we really develop those models? We're going to need all of you around the table. So I think there's all of that, plus it's the structure and governance, and some of the things that Jim said about what do we need below the board to have some scrutiny over some of this is going to be an important part of it, and the structures as well. So I think I've answered the key questions. Thank you.
You have. Well done. Thank you. Tough situation. We'll stick close to it through these meetings and beyond, Kevin. Establishment of the Lancashire and South Cumbria Health and Care Partnership and development of the Integrated Care Strategy.
Yeah, I'll just say a few words of introduction here. We're under a statutory requirement to have an integrated care partnership for the region and an integrated care strategy for the region. these are different to the ICB, and it's different to our long-term plan. So we have a role to play in that, but it's a broader community thing. So we need to understand that. We have really, really tight timescales that we're operating to here. We're being asked to have a draft strategy ready by December. And by the way, that's December 2022. And the new Integrated Care Partnership hasn't even met yet. So these are really, really tight timeframes. So I think we need to be realistic about what we can do this year. I'd just like to make 4 points, really. Number one, we need to keep it simple, because it's going to take 2 to 3 years for this to really mature into something rich. Number two, we need the obvious starting point are the needs assessment and strategies of the health and wellbeing boards across the area. So that's the obvious place to start rather than try and reinvent the wheel. We have got some good foundations in our region. We've got well-functioning health and wellbeing boards. I've been to 3 of the 4 now. We have this ICB, although we were born on the 1st of July, we were a pathfinder. So we've done a lot of work in this space. We've got quite a sophisticated and well-developed population health function in the area. And this board has already set a strategy that does attach top priority to the community, strengthening the community side of our system. So I think we've got really good foundations in place. We are working together with our council colleagues and with the voluntary sector, and there is a nomination going forward for the chair of the ICP going forward, the first chair will be Michael Green. So that needs to be confirmed at a meeting, which is in a few weeks' time. So, look, it's impossible timescales. We need to keep it simple, and we need to use the work that's already in the system and then mature this over the next couple of years.
Thank you, Kevin. Angie, anything you wish to add?
Just to say, working actively, because it is a joint collaboration, really pleased to have been engaged with agreeing the terms of reference, essential. We've made all of our nominations, but we do agree we need to keep it simple, use what's there, and actually, as you say, Kevin, grow into this and let it evolve perhaps quite organically in response to what our communities and partnerships tell us is going to be really important. But at the same time, we do need to be linking in from the communities clear messages to this board to help influence the strategies. So we will lean in heavily with you on this to make sure that we get it landed and meet these really trying timetables.
Thank you. And David?
Thank you. So just a couple of points really. We're really welcome being part of this this new group. I'm happy to be helping, despite the impossible timeframes, to try and get some work out there in communities to try and kind of just check out our thinking. So not doing the usual thing of going and saying, what do you want and how do you want this to be, but more going out and saying, this is what we're thinking. And does that sound about right? So we can do some of that, but it will be very limited within the timeframes that we've got. But happy to, as we say, evolve that over time. I suppose when I was reading this paper, and at the Health and Wellbeing Board in Lancashire yesterday, I was thinking about all of the interconnections between the groups and the boards that we've got and the governance arrangements. So, just to list a few, we've got obviously the Health and Wellbeing Boards, and, clarity about their absolute function would be really helpful. We've got the Integrated Care Board, the Integrated Care Partnership, the place-based partnerships. We've got scrutiny, we've got partnership boards, safeguarding boards, etc. So I was left kind of just thinking, are we, how does that all work together? Have we thought enough about that? Are we duplicating, and is that helpful? So I don't know, just an invitation really to think about, can we streamline some of this? Because like many of you, I find myself sat in lots of meetings literally looking at the same papers over and over again. So I think there is opportunities for us to kind of tighten some of that governance stuff up.
Can you just give us an example of 2 meetings where you've sat with the same paper?
The health equity commission paper that's been it's doing the rounds, and I've heard the same speaker speak more than once on that particular.
But presumably with
item.
different responses from different people.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think there is a lack of clarity about the purpose of each of those meetings. The Health and Wellbeing Board, one of its core aims is to set a strategy for health and well-being, and yet that's very similar to us setting a strategy for the Integrated Care Partnership. And those things are laid out in the guidance and legislation. So what's the similarities, differences and interdependencies, I think is the question.
Thank you, David.
Happy to make it. Look, I'm reminded of an Audit Commission report many, many years ago entitled, "We Can't Go On Meeting Like This." If you had a blank sheet of paper, you wouldn't design it this way. A lot of these arrangements are set out in statute. So I think the real issue is twofold. One, how do we make the statutory system work well? And it's all about relationships and probably co-populating groups so that we're not having this situation where you've got 2 or 3 discussions of the same item. And then it's looking at the discretionary areas to see whether we can streamline that. And I think we should do that together when we cut our teeth and just do it through experience. But that would be my suggestion. But the history here was when the bill was being prepared, there was a bit of a stoush between local government and health over, and that's how we ended up with the ICPs. And we've got a crazy situation where, because they want the community to drive the work this board does, and I think that's the right intention, that should happen, but the idea of doing something in December, we don't have the people in place to do that really, which is why we need to use what's there already. So I think there's theories got in the way of the practicalities, but I think if we get the experience and then look at the discretionary elements, and then the health and well-being people should be on the ICP, etc., etc. The more we can do that, the less we're likely to reinvent the wheel. But I share your concern.
Thank you. Got Jeff, Jim, Debbie.
Well, I'm a big advocate for this. I'm quite excited by this whole development, really, because, the formation of the ICS is about doing something different. And this board has a certain business, and we do have the partners around the table. But actually, I think this is an opportunity to do things different and achieve things differently with the wider partnership in a more creative space than a formal board, personally. I agree with Kevin, we should keep things simple, and we've already got health and wellbeing strategies and JSNAs, so we don't need to do that again. We just need to find a way of bringing that all together for December. That to me is dead easy. We can get more sophisticated year on year. It's about actually how we work together and how we create and facilitate a different environment for our places and our neighbourhoods to deliver on the things that actually are in our core job description, health promotion, population health, reducing health inequalities and integration. That's core to how we're supposed to be working, and that I think that will flourish in this committee. So we don't need to compete with the health and wellbeing boards. They have statutory duties. We just need to use that and then enable the system to deliver on that strategy. So I think it's a good opportunity.
Thank you. And Jim?
Yeah, thanks. I'm encouraged by the enthusiasm for this. It's just a watching brief as far as I'm concerned. So thank you for the update. Really helpful, and I'll be interested to see how this develops. But we're also asked to approve the terms of reference for the Integrated Care Partnership. I've just got 2 comments on that, if I may. One is in the main paper, it talks about meetings not being held in public initially. In the terms of reference, it says meetings will be held in public. So we just need to tighten that up. It also doesn't clarify who are voting members. I don't know whether everybody's a voting member or not, but it lists the people who are on the board, and then it talks about voting members will vote. It doesn't clarify whether they're all voting members or not. And just to say that could do with being clarified.
Absolutely. We'll sharpen that up outside of the meeting. Tracy, then I'll come to Sarah.
Thanks. I echo your enthusiasm for this, and particularly because the work that Sarah James has done, and I really want to pay tribute to Sarah for the way in which she's networked to pull all of this together, and particularly across the voluntary sector, has really placed the sector at the heart of this partnership, and clearly I would welcome that. But I think also the opportunities that affords us in terms of developing this partnership with that really kind of central community feel to it is clear to see within the structure and within this paper. I think one of the things that kind of comes out of this to me loud and clear is that real need for us now as a sector to make sure the structures and the mechanisms that we've been building over the last sort of 2-3 years really enable that work to take place. And I appreciate all you've said about the timescales and the difficulty and the fact there aren't even the people in place to pull, you know, the plan together. But I think there's a lot that we can do on the ground that can really facilitate this. So I suppose it's an offer really from my colleagues across the voluntary sector to say that absolutely we welcome this. We think that this is the place where a lot of the work around how we make some of the innovation happen will be, and a lot of the decisions around how we move towards that more kind of looking at things through that health equity lens and making sure that we understand the needs of our communities. I think this is a real opportunity. So I'm coming at this from the view of we are now at a stage as a sector across the VCFSE to organise ourselves around this so that we can really make a difference and make a contribution.
Thanks, Tracy. It's very helpful. Debbie, then to Sarah.
Thanks. I completely sign up to Kevin's keep it simple, because I think there's nothing worse than continuously asking people, what do you want, what do you think of this, what do you think of that, and us being told and then not actually acting on it collectively. And I think that's one of the huge opportunities through the ICP and system working to join that together as a conversation. Just a really practical suggestion. I think the point when we're talking about how does the system work, how does it fit together, who does what, who's deciding what, I think we've got a responsibility around transparency to try and share that with the public. I sort of sit here thinking when people see these papers and try and understand in their own minds, would they understand how it connects? And it might not be a system that's designed the way that we think is best, and we might do it differently if we had the decision making, but it is kind of the system that we've got. So as well as a glossary, could we look at some kind of framework on one side of a simple slide that sort of just frames it and helps people orientate themselves? Because I think it would help us, because it just reminds us, and it also would help the public to try and understand how things fit together.
Thanks, Debbie. Excellent. Sarah?
Thanks, Chair. I had 2 comments on the terms of reference mainly, and I suppose one was, and I joined a lot of the national calls when the LGA ran and that when they were developing the guidance around this, and there is a bit of conflicting guidance, really, not conflicting guidance, but it's contradicts itself a little bit, because this is a partnership, and yet for the ICB and the local authorities it's a statutory committee. So you then get into the tension, because for me some of the language in it is confusing, because it talks about voting members, but actually it can only really make decisions for the local authorities around the table and the ICB, because it's a statutory committee of those 2 partners. It isn't a statutory committee of the NHS providers or a statutory committee of the voluntary sector. So I feel some of the language in it is a little bit then confusing. And then building on David's point, that's where I think there's the risk of duplication, because it talks in here about workforce, but we're going to have a people's board that's going to be doing the things on workforce. It talks about policy development, but I'm not sure the ICP will be developing policy, and it alludes to it'll make resource decisions, but I don't think it will be able to make resource decisions. So I felt some of the language in the terms of reference needed a little bit more thought, which we can pick up outside the meeting. And then my other comment really was on the membership. I think the membership's great, and again I've sat in meetings in another system and on the national calls around, you know, again the tension here is you could have everybody around the table and it becomes so big, how do you get the focus discussions? But I felt there was just a couple of gaps, and a key gap for me, and I read it 3 times because I thought they were going to be included, was the lack of a DPH, given all the work that's going to be drawing on JSNAs and all the work around population health. I was surprised to not see a director of public health, particularly given we're going to have clinical representatives from mental health and acute and community services, and then also where's social care represented, because local government's there, but that's the elected members, they're there as the voice of the population. not as experts that would be round the table. So for me, they were two gaps, and linked to that gap, a plea was, and it's some work I'm doing with the directors of nursing and AHPs. I think often we equate clinical to be medics, and clinicians aren't just medics, and it's really, really important around the clinical care professional guidance that when we have clinical representatives that we're having a broad view on that, and it's not always doctors, no disrespect to my medical colleagues. So they were my two main comments. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Sarah. I agree with those points. I think there's still a bit of work to do in terms of the terms of reference of the committee in the context of the, you know, David's point about, well, you know, where are the overlaps, where's the duplication? And I rarely disagree with you, Kevin, very rarely disagree, but when you said if we had a blank sheet of paper, we actually did have a blank sheet. Somebody had a blank sheet of paper before they came up with all of this. Yeah. And it is... It reflects a lot of compromises, a lot of different influences, a lot of different interests that wanted to be reflected. We simply have to make the best sense of that we can. I welcome Michael's appointment as the chair in the first instance. We've spoken, we'll meet regularly. The world at large who will look at us, if we're not well aligned in all the different places on this, there will be some things that go into more than one bit of the governance structure. But I think it is about relationships, and it is about pragmatism and alignment. And if we can't align the work of the partnership with the board, and we've got some cross-membership, Kevin and Jeff will be there and others, then the world will start to chant, you don't know what you're doing. So it's incumbent on us to make sure we have that alignment as we go through. It's not a perfect design, it reflects some compromises, but we must make the absolute best of that.
Could I just come back, and I know Abdul wants to come in. Look, we'll make the system work. I think in the terms of reference, we can pick those points up outside of this room. It had always been the intention to have a chief exec, a public health director, adult care director, etc., participating. The issue was when we discussed this with the council chief executives, we felt it was important, given that we didn't have elected members on this board, that they really had a leadership role on the ICP. But it had always been the intention that we have the professionals there at the table, not as members but advising, which is what they normally do anyway. So I'm not sure we need to change the terms of reference to reflect that. It then gets very big. But there are some definitely terms of reference issues that we need to attend to, which we will do.
Thank you, and we can just get the final version back in. Abdul.
Thank you, Chair. Just on the David's point, really, if I may, in relation to the distinction between Health and Wellbeing Boards and the ICP. From a public health, population health perspective, Health and Wellbeing Boards are statutory. They should be focusing on prevention, wider determinants, the actual strategy itself, an action plan in relation to that. The ICP, from a public health perspective, is more a health and social care integration and relates to that integrated care strategy from that lens rather than the wider kind of lens around health and well-being overall for the population. So I hope that nuance, David, actually then, and for the board actually then just helped. And clearly on Sarah's point, really, I would welcome a Director of Public Health representation on the ICP. I know that Dr. Sathi was actually involved with Sarah on the piece of work, really, and obviously I'd like to commend him and Sarah on a great piece of work that they've done to actually take it to this point. And one final point, if I may, the governance really around this, I think having sat in a multitude of similar conversations in different systems. Basically, in Suffolk, we had a conversation about this very issue across the footprints, but also around the intergovernance arrangements in relation to the emerging kind of bodies, really, that were kind of obviously coming into formation. It might be worth linking back really with the LGA and national colleagues on this as to whether there's going to be a clearer articulation between NHS Confed, our NHS colleagues in general, NHSE and because I know that there's a national body and a national group that meets really around these core issues, and whether there's going to be some further guidance actually around the actual governance distinctions and boundaries and what is going to be left to local discretion. Thank you, Chair.
Jeff, do you want the last word?
If I may, I'm just coming back to Sarah's point on governance, which I don't disagree. We need to get the governance right. I thought the wording in the documents was about health and care partnerships driving or creating, not actually deciding. That's how I understood it. So I think personally it'd be fatal if we got to votes. And then we made a decision, and the ICB or the council or someone said, well, not supporting that. So I very much see it as about consensus and creating proposals. But actually, it would be very healthy if it creates proposals that might be difficult for this board, because otherwise, if there isn't a tension, there isn't a progress. So that's just how I see it.
Thank you. Okay. So a number of points have been made about the terms of reference, which, as you said, we'll take away. I think your point, Kevin, the distinction, it's a bit like this board, the distinction between who's here as a member of the board and who's here to give a perspective to help the board and to participate in the discussions is key, and perhaps needs to be brought out a bit more. But certainly the content's noted, and we welcome the progress that's being made in the establishment of the partnership. So thank you. Right, performance report.
So I'll cover the general performance report, and then we've got a deeper dive on primary care, which David will lead on. A few of you around the table would have been involved in the ICS Oversight Board, and you will recall the performance reports that went to that board. They were voluminous, a bit like Encyclopedia Britannica, lots of words and a hell of a lot of charts and lots of numbers.
They were fantastic.
They were brilliant, and nobody ever read them, and you never discussed the contents. So we were trying to do something different here, to have short reports to the point that address the key issues and that answer the simple question, so what? That's where we're trying to get to. This is our first stab. It's definitely not the finished article. I want to make sure that Maggie, when she gets her feet under the table, this is an area she needs to make a difference in. So I expect this to evolve and improve. Very much welcome your views on what does it feel like. Is it too light? Is it too... are there any obvious things missing, etc.? A couple of headlines from the papers. We've clearly got some big challenges on cancer. We will come back to you in more detail later on. We've got mixed performance in mental health. We did hit our 104 target on planned care, and we are making decent progress on the 78-week target there too. We've got some big reds on social care capacity. We have got some projects underway that begin to address parts of that system. Primary care, more said about that later when David deals with it. Urgent and emergency care, some improvements, but faced really high demand in the summer. So we're clearly worried about winter, when that's going to be a much, much bigger challenge. But a lot of work is underway in that space. Big challenges across the workforce, which again will come back to once the People Board is up and running properly. So I hope that gives you an overview, but would really welcome your views about whether this approach of having a high-level general performance report is right, anything missing, anything you want us to do differently, and then the concept of having a deep dive on a topical area each board meeting.
Thanks, Kevin. It's good. Royce, for you, please.
Thanks, Chairman. Like yourself, I don't often disagree with people, and you don't disagree with the Chief Exec, and I don't disagree with the Chair sometimes. But I have to say, I disagree with you on the performance report that used to come to the Strategic Commissioning Committee. Hugely quantitative, lots of information in there that took an age to go through, and you couldn't actually pick out the direct comparisons, I think, across all of the areas within the LSC. I like this report because it's fairly short. I think it's perhaps a bit too short. We need a bit more information in there to be able to understand the position, I think, across LSC. But we've got to remember, we're a strategic committee. You know, that we were looking at the reports that came to the Strategic Commissioning Committee, but they were identifying areas in each of the locality areas. That's for the place-based partnerships to do, I believe. Let's us look at the strategic positions like we're supposed to do. As I said, I think the report itself is fine. It is a little bit, as I say, a little bit short of information. I'd like to see some more qualitative data in there. I spoke about quantitative data, but qualitative data is the important thing. And I'd also like to see how we sort of support the quality committee with this performance data, because it's really important that we have an alignment between performance in terms of quality that come to this board, but also that the quality committee understands that performance data as well and has that qualitative aspect. Just one thing in there that I picked up on was, and we spoke about it earlier, was the out-of-area placements. And I think members of this board will certainly be aware that the out-of-area placements that we had, the LSCFT had, were perhaps the highest or the second highest in the country. And somewhere in here it is saying that LSCFT will like to expand its inpatient capacity. I've got to say that it's had the opportunity to do that over the last, I don't know, few years that I've been involved in CCGs, and we've always had a problem with inpatient capacity. If you look at the harbour in Blackpool, that's always full, you know, and I think it's to improve that inpatient capacity is not going to be an overnight thing. I think it's going to be a really difficult ask, quite frankly. So it's something that I think it is a strategic position that we need to take on it. It's something that needs to be looked at over the next few months, I think. But in the meantime, I think it's really important we look at those out-of-area placements, because some of those out-of-area placements that have been taking place have been, quite frankly, not acceptable to some of the carers or patients, relatives, in being able to access those patients that have been placed in some of those out-of-area positions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Roy. Debbie, did you used to enjoy the old format of report?
I did, and I used to read it as well. I was one of those geeks.
Yes,
and
no. Thank you, Debbie. It's an important contribution.
I was just thinking, what an exciting opportunity for Kevin and Maggie to develop this for us, and what a challenge, because everybody's going to want something slightly different. I think from my perspective, if I sort of mention a few principles, but also a few comments on the measures, that might be helpful, because I know it's something that's going to evolve and develop, but it's so important for us as a board to have something that gives us the assurance, but also points us in the right direction and helps us be clear about risks and changes, and also gives us peace of mind that the execs are focusing in the right area and that traction's there and the improvements there. So in terms of sort of principles for me, I'm a bit different to Roy. I'd like to see everything, or know that everything's being counted, weighed, measured. Don't necessarily need to see that detail to test it, but I need some kind of radar that shares with me what that looks like, who's got hold of it, what we're aiming at, when it's going to be delivered, by when, and if we're not delivering that, what we're doing about it, so that we could actually dip into that at certain times and also hold people to account about that change and that impact if it's not happening. So I'd like some kind of breadth, but also then a high-level report that pulls out for me as a participant in the board, where those areas of risk, opportunity, and outcomes aren't quite being achieved. And I think that includes both performance measures but also unwarranted variation. So we need to be able to see that, understand it and say, well, so what are we doing about it, by when, with what impact, and if that doesn't happen, to be able to sort of see that change and that recalibration. Welcome the first attempt at sort of looking at what the most important measures are. I was surprised on the mental health ones that CAMHS wasn't included. Because having read those SCC reports, the last one that we received was in June, that's always something that I tended to focus on because it was an area of concern that was flagged where referrals were increasing, access to...
In various committees elsewhere. But with that in mind, I think the one thing I think we really need to focus on and concentrate on is that we just have one version of the truth in terms of where the data is pulled from. So if I take elective recovery as one example, I know of at least 4 different pulls of elective recovery, all that's slightly different. And what we absolutely need to avoid is having measures that are slightly different in terms of performance, say in the providers, that we're looking at as a different measure here. So having that one version of the truth and pulling the data from the same source that the whole system can recognise, I think is really fundamental.
I've got a number of people to come in. I've got Jeff, then James.
Thank you, Chair. As you know, I'm a real fan of brevity, so I'm sort of somewhere between Roy, but then I'm erring towards Debbie because actually,
Jeff, can you just be clear about where you're at, please?
Because, and I think I've got a proposal, and that is you do need that detail somewhere. And so I've always been very keen on high-level presentations with links or appendixes. So how you get to a solution that satisfies us all, I don't know. But this is my point, and that is, I think as a board member, I should have the right to access any data I want that would have been in that Roger Parr report that we got in the oversight group previously. So I'd like access to all that stuff if I need it. I think I should have a right to do that. Everyone around this table should have a right to do it, but I don't want to personally see it at every board because I won't read it, and I'll get completely, brain fog trying to look at it. So there are some people like Debbie who can do that, but there's a lot of people who can't. So there's somewhere in between you need to find, but I want that ability to access the data. If I'm dealing with something, I want to know who I go to and who I ask.
That is very clear, thank you.
That's the clear bit.
No, that is extremely clear. I'm very helpful, Jeff, thank you as always. James, then David B, then David L. I've got everybody, we'll get to you in the end.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to say that, so for me, I think this report gives us the opportunity to be more innovative as well around the KPIs. So if I just take the workforce KPIs that are in this report, they're the data that's available right now, and they're very standard. And they're the kind of KPIs that you'd expect to see, but they're only give a very partial picture. But this is a work in progress. And so, for example, I'm keen that we start to include a more holistic set of KPIs around staffing capacity rather than just vacancies or just turnover. Something much more holistic that demonstrates the full breadth of the challenge. Also, cultural KPIs in terms of morale, motivation, well-being, and also more KPIs around transformation, people transformation, service transformation, and productivity as well. So there's a number of really core metrics and KPIs that are strategic, and I think will give us a much more strategic view of what we want to look at. Just to give people some confidence, we're doing a great piece of work right now with the regional HEE and NHSIE team for the People Board. The first meeting of the People Board is later this month, and we're on a third iteration of the very first full system-wide workforce report for Lancashire South Cumbria. That's fairly comprehensive, and that's starting to pick away at some of these more strategic and more insightful KPIs. So once we've taken this through the People Board, the first one this month, we're going to continue to develop. So I think we're going to be able to start to move to a much more strategic place that gives us a much broader view. of the workforce KPIs and others more broadly. So it's quite an exciting journey, I think, and we're doing that completely in partnership with the provider collaborative. Kevin Moynes and colleagues are involved in that piece of work as part of the People Board. So I think this is a start of a 10, and we need to see this as a journey that we can move quite quickly on, I think.
Well done, James. I've got David, then Jim, then Sheena.
Thanks, Chair. So just a couple of points, really. So I definitely think that we're not going to get something that pleases everybody. And at the Quality Committee, we were discussing how we absolutely think that people should have access to the data, from my perspective, including the public, so that they can really hold us to account. And that's where my point lays, really, just about how do we account to the public on how we're doing with openness and with transparency, and how do we make sure that we take the information that we've got here and say, look, we've got some really great successes, but we've also got some really deep challenges, and we're going to need your help with some of them. So I think there's a comms and engagement piece of work that needs to happen around how are we seen to be and actually accountable to people for the performance and quality of the system.
Thanks, David. It's very helpful. And David?
So almost to that point, I just wanted to pick out two areas where I think the board should be aware, which Kevin has highlighted already. The first one is cancer, where all the metrics are red. Now, the good news is, we're not alone in the Northwest and much of the country, because what we have seen is a significant increase in the number of patients being referred with suspected cancer, which is a good news story in some respects, because they can be sorted out and most of those patients won't have cancer. And so they can be, at least they and their family will know that's not an issue. But that does mean that we've got challenges around diagnostics. Again, we don't always have the capacity we need. And we do have one or two fragile services within Lancashire and South Cumbria, particularly around urology, for example, gynae cancers as well, particularly for the specialist surgical services. So we've agreed with the Cancer Alliance, who lead the cancer services for us in Lancashire and South Cumbria, that we will develop a recovery plan. So we're looking at that, we're responding to that, and David, to your point, we will be developing cancer recovery plan to ensure we can improve the performance of those cancer services, recognising the increased demand. And then to Roy's point around out-of-area placements, I've sat in many a national meeting where, unfortunately, Lancashire and South Cumbria was the outlier. We were the top part of the country when it came around to out-of-area placements. The good news, those out-of-area placements are falling, but we still need to look at solutions. And in the paper here, it highlights, yes, we can do some new build, but that's not just the only part of it. So I'm agreeing with you, because what we are aware of is that within the inpatient facility, patients only become a outlier for their length of stay when they hit about 180 days. That's an awful long time, folks, isn't it? And what we really want to do, and I know the Trust are doing this already, they're looking at something called Red to Green, where people have a plan and everybody knows what's going to happen, and they plan the discharge early on, and that's what we really need to be doing. And I think part of that work is, there's three elements. There is probably a need for potentially more beds, but there's a much greater need, which we can lead much sooner, around transformation of some of the way they work within the hospital, and, of course, within the mental health strategy, which has been running for a number of years. It's about growing the community support so patients don't actually end up in a hospital in the first place. They're cared for in the community. So there's three key strands there. And again, talking to some of our folks who are our Director of Mental Health Services, she was suggesting that we could develop a plan around some of those three key areas to ensure that we're in a position that we can understand what work can be done sooner, and we understand when those out-of-area placements may fall a bit further. Okay, so it's just by way of 2 points.
It's very helpful, David. Thank you. Jim, then Sheena, then Angie, then Sarah.
Wow, thank you. I'll be quick then. Thank you. I don't think we should get too hidebound on the format of the report. So, specifying in advance what the report looks like, I don't think is the right thing to do. You are developing it. There's someone new coming in, going to develop it further. I think we need to see what they produce. But I'm agreeing with the way Debbie outlined what we're looking for, which is assurance in a number of key areas. Now, it's either through this report, not necessarily, but possibly through the appendix Jeff talked about, or possibly through work being done outside this committee, which is feeding into this committee. But I'm looking for assurance in areas like clinical outcomes, patient safety, productivity. I want us to be able to identify a system failure before it happens almost. So I don't want to read in the paper that there's another maternity issue on this patch. So I would hope that this report was providing information that would actually highlight those things before they became a problem. So I personally wouldn't see us saying this has got to be a one-page report. It needs to be what it needs to be. As simple as it can be, but not so simple that it's not usable, basically. So don't specify it in advance. And the other point I would make is, Roy said we're a strategic body. I'm not so sure we are now. You know, when I read what was this body is supposed to do in terms of winter planning, we're quite operational now. So we are strategic, but we're also becoming more operational and more charged with direct oversight of systems, which is perhaps, I know that wasn't where we necessarily wanted it to get to. Yeah, exactly. And that changes, in a sense, almost what we need to be getting assurance on.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. It's very helpful. Sheena, Angie, Sarah, Jane.
So the benefit of coming last or later, is actually the points I was going to make have already been picked up, which was about the wider people issues, the mental health transformation, and also the forward look. So I'm not going to ask any more questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheena. Angie?
Thank you. And look, I really feel the pain on this because we're just trying to work through this at the County Council. So absolutely get all of those challenges and conflicting issues. So I just really wanted to reflect a little bit on the principles that we've talked about, the current scorecard and what that's telling us, because we, as David reminded us, actually we do need to be looking at that, and then just talk about the next steps and the next evolution of the scorecard. So for me, I agree there are certain principles that we should be sticking to, which people have talked about. So the single data set is really important, but data on its own isn't good enough. So picking up some of those other points about we need anecdote in there, and we also need that to be backed up with the insight from the professionals who are servicing the performance report, so that they interpret that and give us the analysis, which will then help us to identify where we home in. For me, I always step back and I look at the congruence. You know, are the numbers, is the commentary, are the outcomes telling me exactly what I see in the system? And that's my first question. Does this look like the organisation I recognise? And I think what we've seen in this current set is that's not the case. So I don't necessarily think that we would see GPs as being green because of exactly the points that Jeff made earlier in this board. And I certainly don't think we would see mental health as being primarily green. So there is something for me that the current data set is not giving me the issues, and I'm not sure the commentary really brought to life about where there was incongruence and what we're doing about it as an executive. So I'd like to understand a little bit more as a board as to where we're doing, how we're working with those things. And I think the most important thing for us is the executive summaries that accompany this. We have to have confidence in the executive to give us their commentary and insight in an accessible way, but also then to look beyond the scorecard. So I don't want the commentary just sticking to the scorecard, because we've already acknowledged, haven't we, that the scorecard can never pick up everything. And we do need the executive to come forward and say, well, the scorecard tells us this, but you need to know about that as the other thing. So I think really empowering our executive to come forward with that is going to be really important. Moving to the next steps. Designing the scorecard is going to be really important, and that's going to have to be heavily influenced, isn't it, by the integrated care strategy, the draft of which will be ready in December, and the outcomes framework, which we've talked about. So that's going to be really important. And for me and for local government, there are some very key indicators that are just not featuring at the moment. It is very much sort of acute NHS-led, so some of the safeguarding indicators, some of the SEND indicators, some of the children's indicators in particular, and broader data sets are missing. So we'd like to work with you to make sure that we get the right balanced scorecard. And again, the integrated care strategy will help to drive that. We need to make sure that then when we operate this, we are not just shunting problems, because if you can measure it, people will make that measurement work and put problems down the system. So our responses, when we look at the insight, we need to make sure that we're not just moving a problem from social care into the acutes or from the GPs into social care. We just need to think about that system-wide thing. And then finally, I really agree with the point about warranted variation. And again, that's for the executive to come forward and make sure that's highlighted for us. So I don't think we've quite got it there at the moment, and I'd like more background on those areas, in particular GPs and mental health, because I don't think that's brought out in the current data set. And then we will absolutely work with you to get the better balanced scorecard going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Angie. Very helpful. Getting really building now in the conversation. Yeah. We're one or two more, then I'll come back to Maggie and Kevin at the end. Sarah, then Jane, please.
Thanks, Chair. A couple of comments, and it does build on. I suppose listening to people, I would favour a short report with a scorecard because I think it's easier. However, listening to everybody, the thing that crossed my mind was we could possibly learn here from our NHS providers who over a number of years have had to do a lot of work around having an integrated performance report, which actually, when you look at them, they work really, really well, and I think that would give the board the balance of having that that type of report that would give you all the key metrics that we're accountable for, but the report that comes with it could be a shorter scorecard approach, and I like the idea of a deep dive. And then my other comment builds on the variation, and it's a comment I have on the primary care paper. I've got two comments on that, but I'll make one of them now. And I agree around the variation. It's not just about unwarranted variation for me. You know, and I'll give you an example. Proportion of people aged over 14 with a learning disability getting an annual health check, that's amber. But of course what that will be masking is that there'll be parts of our population where that's really not good at all, and other parts where it's green, so as an average it's amber. And for me, at least as a minimum, I'd want to see this broken down by the 4 places, so that as a board we've got oversight of the variation across the region, not just Lancs and South Cumbrian. Again, I think when we get to the primary care paper, it's very positive because it's given an overarching view, but we know there'll be significant variation across primary care in terms of the couple of metrics we've got there. So I think we do need to see it at least as a minimum by place going forward.
Very good, thank you. Continuing to build on this is great. And Jane.
Thank you, Chair. This needs to be driven by strategic objectives, and I think there's a very interesting iterative process going on about what our strategic objectives actually are. If you look at high-level strategic objectives for ICBs, that's one thing, but we're now getting into accountability, delivery, performance, all kinds of things. And so I think we've got to kind of work through that a little bit more before we know what we're trying to measure, actually. I would endorse what other people have said about qualitative and quantitative and interpretation of data, not just the data. So what's it actually telling us? We need to understand that. It's easy to measure things but not understand. My last point, just briefly, relates to one of our objectives is around health inequalities. We haven't talked much about it today, which is quite interesting. It's almost like implicit in everything. We keep talking about winter pressures, but in fact, what's going on with cost of living and everything else has a real risk of making health inequalities worse. It's bad for everybody, and for our most disadvantaged groups, it's going to be worse. And looking at this at the moment, some of the data that we'll be looking at, it's almost like you've got to apply a health inequalities lens to those as well. You know, who's going to primary care, who's getting treated for cancer, who's, you know, and is there a disproportionate, you know, a kind of spread. So I think one of the real things I'm keen to do is support that health inequalities agenda. We have to be really careful that we think about how we actually try and track how we're doing on that one, particularly at the moment, as I say, when it's challenging and may get worse.
Thanks, Jane. Absolutely right. And Roy, last word.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. Learnt a lot from this conversation. Probably the most important thing is not to go first in a debate. But just on the point on the data there and accessing the data and being assured with regards to that data, I think perhaps we might consider, having an exception report at the beginning, a short exception report, having the data available, but also just having that exception report that just points to some of the really important things that are in that data. So that's just all from me, David.
Thanks, Roy. That's good. Right, Kevin and Maggie. So you've got a feel for the high motivation of the board to get into understanding what's going on around our system and what we're doing about it and how we discharge our responsibilities and accountability on all of that. So I think we've got a lot of rich stuff, contributions in this now for you guys to take away and think about.
Really good conversation. I'll handle. I'm really glad Maggie's handling this. It's the first observation. I knew we were asking for trouble here. Some want more, some want less, etc. I think my overwhelming reflection would be this. There are probably 3 different levels of information. There's information for you as a board, and the whole concept of a balanced scorecard is it's about delivering your strategic priorities. That has got to be number 1. If we have loads and loads of indicators, you've got too many priorities and we won't get much done. So I think that's something we've got to keep an eye on. And the health service is awful at this. They have way too many priorities and we're not really great at getting stuff done. That's the honest. That's the political debate that's going on now. That's the political debate that's going on now. The second thing is we as managers need even more. So what are the requirements of management? And actually a lot of those workforce issues will be management issues. So there's a board set of priorities and there's a balanced scorecard for you, and then there's a separate thing which should be related and cascaded but in more detail for management. And then coming back to David's point, there's what's the right thing for the public as well. So these are 3 related but different things with different audiences. And obviously today we were trying to focus on the board side of it. And look, we've got an initial strategy. That's going to be refined, it's going to change, and it's going to be influenced by the politics that's going on now, isn't it? There are going to be some different priorities that emerge in the next few weeks. So I just think we've got to get all of that clear. And it's probably going to iterate several times, I'm feeling, from this. And we probably need some workshops on some of the sessions. But, you know, I knew we wouldn't get it right first time. I've got the message. We will take another look at this. We also need to make sure that we are delving into the detail in picking the right areas at the right time. I think, you know, UEC is definitely the right area for our next board meeting. Clearly that connection between hospital and the community is going to be another key area going forward. We'll have elective recovery will be another high priority for government and for our communities. So, I mean, there are some obvious areas, but good luck, Maggie.
Thank you. So I suppose most of you know that I've spent, you know, best part of 10 years working with very challenged organisations. And the reasons all of those organisations get challenged is because they didn't get this right at the very beginning. So they're not looking in the right places, they spend the wrong amount of time discussing the wrong things, and actually really good people who end up in a real old pickle because they didn't take the time to get this right. Now we can spend forever trying to perfect it, and perfection is the enemy of good in my book. So we do have to land on something that we find really useful really quickly. But we trying to manage the expectations of your boss is always good. We won't get this sorted in a month. We will, I would strongly suggest, need to go into workshop to look at this as well. I can quite easily bring you some examples of what other ICBs and other high-performing organisations are using as metrics that help them. And we can maybe settle on a format that pleases the majority of us, and we can evaluate and review that as we get through the quarters to see if things are happening, as Jim said, if does something take us by surprise, and we can then look at why our scorecard, our IPR has let that happen. So I do not propose to suggest to you we'll have it fixed in a month or by Christmas, but we'll have something a bit smarter, a bit quicker than that. And of course we will want to use the centre as well, because we have to be really clear, don't we? If we do get into difficulties that they don't say, well, look at all your papers, you weren't even ever looking at the right things. So we really need to understand what they expect us to be doing. I'd also like to present to you something that shows you where everything else is being discussed. So I think, you know, the really important things, whether it be strategic or not, that we are discussing, can we be assured that CAMS, etc., is being discussed in the right place and exceptions coming here? So I need to get my head around it, and we'll be bringing something back in October, but it'll get smarter as we get into the months. Can't wait.
Thanks, Maggie. Right. Primary care access, David.
Okay, I'm sorry if I'm going to disappoint people as this is not such an upbeat report. I'm going to put a little bit of context around this first of all. First of all, it's really important to recognise that primary care is responsible for 90% of NHS activity every day. And for that 90%, it receives around about 8% of the NHS budget. Okay? The next thing is to just remind ourselves that back in 2015, when David Cameron was re-elected, he pledged 5,000 more GPs by 2020. And we had the GP Forward View. And it's reflections we go through these metrics of the kind of really challenging and deep-seated issues that we have within the workforce for primary care. And also, as you look through the papers, you'll see later on we have the papers and the highlight reports from the primary care contracting group. And it's again a measure of the fragility of the services now that Jeff referred to earlier about practices handing back their contracts. And there's an example of that in that report, and practices closing their lists. So here we have a very fragile service, an incredibly important service for the whole of the NHS. But yet there are some real challenges here. So challenges before COVID. With COVID, what we've seen is we have seen GPs working incredibly hard. We've got their teams working very hard. They've embraced new models of care and managing and engaging with patients. So, for example, you can now email your GP, and usually they'll come back to you within 24 hours, if not sooner. You can send as many emails as you like in a day. And of course, the other thing is they now have we have telephone consultations, you have face-to-face consultations. They are doing a lot more than they've ever done. However, what we have seen since COVID, and if you speak to those working in primary care, significantly increased demand from patients. Patients want to be seen, and of course, because you can email and start a conversation, it's so much easier to do so. And the threshold for patients to engage with primary care teams has fallen. So the fact is that there's more patients coming through, and that threshold is lower, but patients' expectations for response times has risen. So you can see there's quite a few kind of challenges there at the moment. So you will remember last month we talked about the fact that we were going to look at the Fuller report and how we'll be developing that, and that is going to be part of one of our key solutions because that covers workforce, it covers estates, and how we ensure that patients get ready access to that urgent care that they may require on the day. But the bottom line, and it's the last of the bullets in the current issues, is the current operating model is not resilient or sustainable. And that's what we need to be addressing as an ICB. So we do have, going on to the third point, we do have the development of the Fuller Plus strategy, and that there's been a number of workshops that have been moving forward. They've been very well received by primary care teams, lots of engagement, and the national team are so impressed with that for the North West, this is now going to be the lead ICB for Fuller, which is very good news. And I'll come on to the metrics in a moment, but what we do need to do is think about the delivery of that Fuller report and developing a more sustainable primary care. The metrics themselves, well, you can see there's a lot of primary care appointments taking place. It waxes and wanes a little bit, but nevertheless, the important thing that approximately 2/3 of those are face-to-face, just over half of them provided by a GP themselves. because of the general practice forward view, what we have seen is an increase in the primary care teams. So the good news is we have more nurses, which is fantastic. We have more pharmacists as well, providing help and support to patients in primary care. However, what you can also see within the metrics, we've got fewer GPs as a full-time equivalent. So those who are eagle-eyed and can open up the metrics for the workforce at the start of that chart actually is 2015. So since the general practice forward view, we've actually had, we've got 13% less GPs, full-time equivalent. And GPs are choosing to work part-time as well. And you can see that our population who is working in primary care, the workforce tend to now move into an older age group as well, unfortunately as well. Getting through to a GP practice on the phone, well, unfortunately, is a challenge, and it's the same as everywhere else. And again, it is about potentially having more staff. The problem is when you have more staff, we haven't got the estates to put them in at the moment. But the final thing which I'll come to, which I know Debbie will raise otherwise, is the overall patient experience for general practice. Now, this is a very short report, and having spoken to the primary care team, there is, in fact, a complimentary 84 slide set which has been reviewed by the ICB primary care team, and they have developed an action plan based on that. But of course, it's not here today because we were all told to write a short report, but I welcome any questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you, David. It's good. Now, we have this discussion. Kevin made the point in the discussion earlier about the performance report, about a single version of the truth. And there's like everybody has a view. Driving in, I don't know if anybody else stopped at the same place from junction 33 this morning. As you come up into the traffic lights in Goldgate, depending on where you stop, I stopped right outside a house with a poster in the window on you see that, on a website that says, "Why are we waiting?" And this poster says 49% of us can't see a GP. Now, that's illustrative of the very broad debate and the emotion that people feel at the moment around this whole issue. It's not factually correct, but it reflects the profile and the emotion in this issue. Jeff?
Well, it's an enormous problem. I welcome David bringing this. GP, and I used to consult in the 80s. Oh, sorry. Thank you. I've got a loud voice, I forgot. I used to consult in the 80s and see patients about 2 times per year on average. Now I see them 9 times a year. There hasn't been a commensurate growth in funding and workforce since then, and the planning around this has been a bit dire. So while we see growth in other sectors and growth in demand, we don't see the growth in primary care. So general practice is a bit demoralised at the moment because it was in a bad state before the pandemic, and the pandemic and well, we're not post-pandemic now, but the issues from the pandemic, long COVID, mental health issues, keeping up with patients who are awaiting elective care, all those sort of things have added to the workload. And the data is very clear. The NHS data is very clear that actually less GPs are doing more work. Now, I know there's always an issue about, is it being counted right? But working in the system, I think that's true. And the additional roles that we're seeing are very welcome, but actually patients still want to see their GP a lot of the time and need to see the GP a lot of the time. So there's 3 elements to me. There's the increasing demand. Why is that happening? There's the decreasing capacity to meet it, and the model of how we deliver it in the middle, which David's referred to, the sustainability of how we work at the present time. So I think we need to address all 3 elements personally. And it's beyond this board to have that discussion now. So it needs the kind of approach David's having with the Fuller workshops. I think Fuller's good, but I think we need to go beyond Fuller. there are things, let's face it, that we can't deal with because they are derived nationally, the GP contract, the GP funding, but we hope that there are changes in that because we hope that the national bodies recognise the risk. And there are things that only GPs can do, like working more together. We can't make them do that, but it obviously aids the way we deliver things. But for this board, it's key, what can we do? And I would urge us to give it a focus like David has done, but I would urge us to take note of the King's Fund report that came out at the same time as Fuller, and it was called something like Levers for Change. And it was basically an evidence-based assessment of how you get us difficult GPs to change. And it will be difficult because you know, we're independent contractors, we like our autonomy, and so there's an art to the way we actually work with primary care to actually recognise the problem and come up with solutions that we can facilitate. So it's a big problem, and I'm glad it's here today.
Thank you. Debbie?
Thanks, David. Thanks, David, for the paper. Really interesting and really helpful. And I think the deep dives are really important, aren't they, in terms of helping the board focus on particular areas of opportunity, challenge, and sort of just checking what the strategy is in terms of responding to that and an increase in impact. One of the most important roles of the new Public Involvement and Engagement Advisory Committee is sort of looking at key areas and giving assurance back to board. And in the first workshop that we had, we started to look at how that would work in the committee. In the second workshop that we have next week, we'll look in more detail at it. But one of the things that we've decided to do is, it's almost death by deep dive, isn't it? But we'll have sort of insight topics at each of those meetings that, on behalf of the board, takes a closer look at what's the public experience, what's the data, what's the intelligence, what's the anecdotes that are coming through various sources that tells us how things are working, and is there anything that we need to escalate through to board to raise awareness of around sort of a strategic response to that. So one of the things that we've decided that we'll do is we're looking at the new hospital programme in the first workshop to pilot the approach and see how it works. But the first committee meeting will look at primary care in October. So hopefully that's a good example where maybe the board's appetite's wet in a particular area and the committee can actually do the legwork around what does this look like. It's going to be complicated, it'll be complex, but then share that understanding and assurance back with board.
Thanks, Debbie. That's great. I've got David, then Kevin.
Yeah, a similar point. Thank you. Really interesting to see the experience data. So, and one question is, I'd just like to understand a little bit more about where that's coming from, and so if there is more detail to share on that, I'd really welcome that. But perhaps we'll get that in the committee meeting. The second thing was just to kind of draw people's attention to a piece of work that you or the CCG's commissioned Healthwatch to do last year, which was looking at A&E attendances, and we sent our staff out into A&Es across the patch and just asked people over many sessions, daytime, nighttime, why are you here? And did you think about doing other things before you came here? And so the report details what people told us. And in there's some kind of really interesting things, but it's really connected to this piece of work, which is, you know, getting through to 111 is really difficult, and it takes 45 minutes of ringing before I even get through. So, you know, and lots of other things. I won't go into lots of the detail, but people's experience at this point is driving some of the challenges and problems that we've got everywhere else. So, I mean, it's just, I mean, I know we know that, but it's to kind of bring that back to the fore. And we've already got a piece of work that tells us what people's experience is of this. So let's use it and not reinvent the wheel with this.
Thank you, David. And Kevin?
A few comments if I may, but I will be really quick. But just to preface them, I know I'm talking through an acute lens, so I accept that when I make these comments. First comment is, I'm not really clear yet, and I know we're not there, but we do need to be clear in terms of what's going to be our strategy around primary care for the future. So in some parts of the country, they're really pushing for much closer integration between acute and primary care. I'm not saying I advocate that, but that's what's happening in parts of the country. So, you know, is that something we would want to look at? I'd say in the acute sector, you know, we are measured to the infinite degree. It's really good to see clearer measurements coming through from primary care. But I think there's still a lot more work to do on what those measurements will be, because we always say, don't we, what measures gets done. So I think it's really important that we focus on the correct measurements. I also accept the point that primary care is busier, but I'm not sure that primary care is busier doing what we want primary care to do. And I notice in the report there's a really important point that talks about, you know, a large proportion of patients have not had their long-term conditions reviewed. And that's quite fundamental in terms of the health of the population. But it also has a significant impact then on what we see through A&E departments and what we see within our hospitals. So there is something about what primary care is doing, accepting that it is a lot busier. Yeah. And then the final point is, I think it's really great that we're seeing an additional workforce development within primary care. So it's not just GP-led; it's a real holistic workforce. But I think what we really need to do as a system is to focus on the fact that that workforce needs to be additionality. And I think what we're seeing in some parts of our patch is some of that workforce is being pulled from secondary care. So additional nurses, pharmacists, etc. We've got real instances where it's coming from our acute trusts, and there is causing a problem there. So I think it's the additionality that we need to really focus on in terms of the workforce for primary care for the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Good points. Sarah, then back to Jeff.
Yeah, a couple of points. I suppose the points are a little bit linked to getting the deep dive papers right, because part of this is a learning. And so for me, what the paper, I think we can take a lot of the comments that were made on the overarching report to that, but for me what the paper lacks is the so what. So, you know, we know access is really important to the public because it's in the media all the time, but what that paper doesn't tell me, I'd like to have seen, is but what's the impact of that lack of access? So what's the impact on MWAS? I know MWAS have got some data that shows significant variations from GPs who sometimes in hours are actually telling the patients to ring 111 instead of seeing them, which adds burden to MWAS. What's the impact on A&E departments? But actually, most importantly, what's not in there at all is what's the impact on clinical outcomes. And we allude to it a little bit in the scorecard with some of the data around hypertension and that, and we allude to it a bit in the paper with the long-term condition review. It says they're not done, but it doesn't tell us, are they not done everywhere, or is it in different parts of it? So, and again, I would want to see, if we did another primary care deep dive, the variation across the patch, because there will be huge variation, because then for us as a board, if the papers get it right, it might drive some of our decisions. It might drive our decisions on resource. It might drive our decisions on actually primary care in this part of the system gets it right, but over here they don't. How can we learn from it? So for me, it's more comments about building on this to get the deep dive papers right. And then my last comment, it alludes to it in the paper and we hear it a lot. Oh, the public don't want to see a non-GP. They only want to see a GP. I actually challenge that personally. You know, I was a nurse consultant for years and I was never questioned by the patients coming up. In fact, often it was the other way around. The patients would prefer to see me than see the consultants in clinic. I went to a hospital appointment last week and I was seen by a nurse practitioner. I wasn't bothered. I didn't question it. I think that's about us working with the public. I actually don't think they're still hung on it has to be a GP anymore. I think they get that a wide range of professionals can deliver frontline care, and I think we've just got to, I think sometimes that's used almost as an excuse for the access in primary care, and I actually don't think if you really sat the public down and worked with them that is actually the case.
Thanks, Sarah and Jeff.
There is a huge amount of data that you haven't got time to present at this board, but it would be worthwhile looking at that data, having a really comprehensive, if you want to really get into primary care, have a workshop for the board around primary care. There's a huge amount around workforce, workload, etc., etc. It goes on for miles, and we could spend days looking at it, and it's very telling. I do two comments really, one about Kevin's point and one about Sarah's point. Kevin's point, there's two things to being a GP. There's one, the clinical model you work in, and there's one, the business model you work in. Now, GPs find it hard to separate it, and when you try to tell them that you want to change the clinical model, they think you're trying to change the business model. In other words, they say, you're trying to take my contract away, stop me being an independent contractor. And my advice to the board would be to focus on changing the clinical model. So they may choose to change the business model and become salaried and work with the trust or work in partnership with the trust or what have you. And I think that's a valuable way of supporting primary care. But I would suggest the key thing to try and solve the workload issues and access is look at the clinical model and not challenge the business model. And then primary care will follow its nose as to what the best business model will be. That's my first point. And I think Sarah's absolutely right. We have to change the clinical model to be not just to be doctor-centric, and we need to have an adult conversation with the population about the world's changing. We can't go back to the way it was. We can't go. You know, I ran a single-handed practice with 3,000 patients for 7 years, and it was fantastic. And I knew every patient, and I could do every, that gave incredible quality, but I couldn't sustain that. I was a young man then, and I'm not anymore. So we need to learn these new models and work with the public. And GPs, I think the GPs who are up for change will say this. They will say, something's got to give. I can't do urgent same-day care and elective care, chronic disease management, chronic complex disease management and diagnosis. Something's got care homes, urgent care visiting and everything. Something's got to give. So I think that's something we could give some direction to. And Fuller makes the reference to urgent same-day care. That's a topic, no matter how serious the disease, that's a topic actually where you don't need continuity. Actually what you need is rapid access to a clinician who knows what they're doing. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a doctor, it can be a paramedic. If you've got chest pain, it can be an advanced nurse practitioner. It could be a healthcare assistant. So I think we need to look at that in the round and say, what is the bit that we can take off primary care so they can do the rest better, so it takes the pressure off the system. That would be my advice.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you. Right, David, number of points there. Sarah used the phrase the so what question about next, and I know that we're going to have a primary care strategy. I know that some of the issues around recruitment and retention and all that come back to the contract, which is a bit out of scope for us at the moment and all of that. But I think that when we've done these I like the model of the deep dive. It's important that we come back, not in immediate response to the discussion. So having looked at the evidence of where we're at now, having taken ideas and reflections and suggestions, observations and questions from here, then how does that build into what are the next steps?
That works perfectly, yeah.
So I think, I mean, to Debbie's kind invitation, I'm sure that'd be great for the primary care team to come along and talk about the patient experience, because they have done the plan, and I'm sure they'll be delighted to share that with you. I think with regard to the impact, you're quite right, Sarah. I mean, and we're well aware of that impact. In some respects, because the deep dive papers are relatively short, it's difficult to kind of build that all in. But I think as we do the papers in the future, maybe we do need to have a kind of a paragraph on impact or key risks, okay? Because it is alluded to. There is a lot of data, as Jeff says, in primary care. And a lot of that data has been pulled together by our ICB primary care team for the Fuller workshops. They've done it for workforce and access and other areas. So that data is available and being used. And of course, that's being used to inform the discussions we are having with the primary care teams who attend the workshops. So it's really great. You know, they're looking at the data. And I was on a call yesterday evening where someone turned around and said, I was on the workshop, it was brilliant. It was so good to see so much of the data. It really informed our discussions. And the final, and I imagine Sheena will be asking us to come to quality boards sometime with some update on primary care quality and impact. We could do that. Would be quite a good place for it to come. And the final thing to say, maybe you're on you're driving in this morning just after 8 o'clock, where Teresa Coffey was speaking on the radio, and she has she's the new health secretary. She's got her ABCD, hasn't she? A's for appointments, and that means primary care. So we'll have to see what she has to say as well. But thank you.
Thanks, David. That's good. I'm conscious that we've run over time. It's been important, all the contributions, though. Can we take the summary of committee reports as read? Are there any, certainly I don't want to hold any back, is there any questions to any of the chairs of committees? I'm looking to Jim and Sheena, in particular, anything that you want to highlight out of the paper? Jim?
Just to mention something that I mentioned at the last meeting, we did approve the external auditor's but nothing more than that to say.
Thank you.
So,
Okay.
just very briefly, we had our first meeting, which was really thinking about how we want to work, and that's really important in terms of ensuring that we look at the added value from the work that we do, and to take very much a population perspective and taking that view about integration, and how what's it like from the perspective of a person or a member of the population of Lancs and South Cumbria. And then the final bit is just to make sure that we are very clear about who's doing what in the system. So what we don't want to do is to kind of double run stuff or even triple run stuff. So, for example, trusts have very good ways of looking at the quality. So what we're looking for them is about the assurance about how they're doing that and taking that forward. So really, it's a really, I think, a really great opportunity to really think in a way about how we're really going to make a difference to outcomes by looking at quality in that sort of systemic, integrated fashion.
Excellent. And I think that the way in which the committees which are at slightly different stages of development, we'll talk more about the people board and so on in due course, and the primary care contracting. The way in which we get the right flow, it plays in some of the discussions from the performance report, from what's going into the committees to what comes to the board. We'll learn as we go. Thank you both for that. I've not been notified of any items of any other business. Notwithstanding the discussion we had earlier about finding new venues and places to go to, we've booked, it's only a few weeks away, our next meeting on the 12th of October will be here again with the same start time. So I'll bring this meeting to a close. I thank you very much for your contributions. I think we're developing well as a group of people together, looking at the issues and challenges that we face. So I appreciate all the preparation that you've done and all the contribution that you make in the meeting. We'll have a 5-minute break now, and then there's a part 2 for members only of the board. Thank you.